The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia hold many secrets, some buried beneath ancient soil, others hidden in plain sight. But the deepest mysteries often lie within the people who call these misty peaks home. For 12 years, Rebecca Caldwell lived a quiet life at the edge of Pinecrest, tending her land and keeping to herself. The locals knew her as the soft-spoken herbalist widow who rarely ventured into town. What they didn't know was that darkness had never been Rebecca's enemy. It had been her ally since childhood. And on that moonless October night, when the Blackridge gang surrounded her isolated cabin, they were about to learn a harsh lesson about judging what they couldn't understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Forgotten Hollow, where Rebecca Caldwell's cabin stood, wasn't on most maps of Shenandoah County. Nestled between two imposing ridges where the forest grew dense and wild, the property sat at the end of a winding dirt road that turned treacherous. After even modest rainfall, a natural spring fed the small creek that cut across her 5 acres, providing water that locals claimed was sweeter than any in the valley. The cabin itself was deceptively sturdy, hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, a stone chimney that rose like a sentinel against the eastern wall, and a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides, offering shelter and a vantage point in equal measure. October had painted the surrounding forest in blazing oranges and deep crimsons, but as the month drew to a close, many trees stood bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a grey sky, heavy with the promise of the first winter snow. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, with an underlying chill that seeped through layers of clothing and settled in the bones. Inside the cabin, Rebecca Caldwell worked methodically, her hands sorting dried herbs and roots, spread across the broad oak table that dominated her main room. At 46, she moved with the fluid efficiency of someone intimately familiar with their space and purpose. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was secured in a practical braid that hung down her back. She wore simple clothes, a worn blue cotton dress beneath a faded apron, its pockets bulging with small tools of her trade. The cabin's interior belied its rustic exterior. Shelves lined the walls, carefully organized with glass jars containing dried plants, powders, and tinctures. Books stood in neat rows, texts on botany, medicine, and folklore collected over years. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the corner, its warmth reaching toward but never quite touching the far corners of the room. Lantern light cast a golden glow over her workspace. Though she often worked by just the firelight, her hands never faltering even in near darkness. Rebecca's features held the weathered quality of someone who spent time outdoors in all seasons, but her grey-green eyes remained sharp and clear, taking in details others might miss, those eyes now focused on the task before her, preparing remedies for Mrs. Patterson's arthritis and Sheriff Hayes's chronic cough. The people of Pinecrest might keep their distance socially, but many made the journey to her cabin when conventional medicines failed them. 4:15, she murmured to herself, glancing at the pendulum clock on the wall, lights already fading. The shortening days meant longer nights, a fact that bothered the townspeople but had never troubled Rebecca. While others hurried to finish their outdoor tasks before darkness fell, she often began her most important work after sunset. She corked the last bottle of tincture and labeled it with precise handwriting. Above the stone fireplace hung an unusual item that occasionally drew questions from the rare visitors to her home, a cavalry saber mounted horizontally on 2 hand-forged iron brackets. Unlike the practical tools and medicinal supplies that characterized the rest of her living space, the sword seemed out of place, almost ornamental. Yet anyone looking closely would notice it was positioned for easy access, its blade maintained with the same care she showed her herbs and garden. Thomas's sword, visitors sometimes remarked, assuming it belonged to her late husband. Family, heirloom, was her invariable response, offering nothing more. What she never mentioned was that the saber had never belonged to Thomas Caldwell. Nor did she speak of the leather case beneath her bed, containing folded newspaper clippings about the Shadow Scout, a near-mythical Union Army scout who had guided troops through Confederate territory during the darkest nights, reportedly able to navigate where others were blind. The stories had faded from public memory over the 12 years since the war's end, becoming little more than fireside tales. Rebecca finished her work as the last daylight retreated from her windows. She moved to light additional lanterns, but paused, her head tilting slightly as though listening. Instead, she extinguished the one burning lamp. The cabin fell into near-complete darkness, save for the orange glow from the stove's vents and the faint light of banked coals in the fireplace. To most, the sudden darkness would be disorienting. To Rebecca, it was clarifying. Her pupils dilated rapidly, her vision adjusting with unusual speed. While most people would see only shadows, she discerned shapes, contours, and movements with remarkable precision, a condition present since birth that had shaped her entire life. As a child in Vermont, her parents had protected her unusual gift, recognizing both its value and the danger of others discovering it. "Some see with their eyes, some with their hearts," her mother had said. "You, Rebecca, see with both." That sight had served the Union Army well, though official records made no mention of the woman who guided night missions through enemy territory, dressed as a young private. The quiet of her evening routine was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching, unusual for this hour and location. Rebecca moved to the north-facing window, her body instinctively staying to the side rather than standing directly in front of the glass. Her exceptional night vision caught what others might have missed: the silhouettes of riders moving slowly along the road toward her cabin, their lanterns doused, 6 men on horseback traveling without light, approaching an isolated cabin as darkness fell. Rebecca knew trouble when she saw it. Sheriff Hayes had warned her just last week about the Blackridge gang moving through the region. 5, maybe 6 men, he'd said during his visit to collect his medicine. Led by the Preston brothers, been hitting isolated homesteads between here and Rockingham County, taking valuables, livestock, whatever they can carry. Killed a farmer over in Crawford Hollow who tried to stop them. Rebecca had nodded, thanked him for the warning, but said little else. Hayes had given her a curious look before leaving. "Maybe. Come stay in town for a spell, Miss Caldwell. Safer there." "The cabin suits me fine, Sheriff," had been her only response. Now, watching the riders approach, Rebecca mentally catalogued what she knew of the gang from Hayes' description and newspaper accounts. The Preston brothers, Jackson and Edwin, had started robbing stagecoaches after returning from the war, gradually gathering a small crew of like-minded veterans with few prospects and fewer scruples. They'd grown bolder over the past year, moving from transportation routes to isolated properties where resistance was minimal and help was far away. Rebecca moved away from the window with practiced silence, her steps finding the solid parts of the floorboards that wouldn't creak. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached the clearing around her cabin. Most widows living alone might have panicked. Some might have attempted to flee into the forest. Others might have prepared to surrender whatever valuables they possessed, in hopes the intruders would take what they wanted and leave without violence. Rebecca did none of these things. With calm efficiency, she moved to the far corner of the room, knelt beside a trunk, and unlocked it with a key she wore on a leather cord around her neck. From within, she removed several items: a Remington revolver that she checked and loaded with practiced hands, a leather belt with pouches containing additional ammunition, a sheathed hunting knife, and finally a small tin box containing what appeared to be fine, black powder. The trunk's false bottom concealed one final item, a Union cavalry officer's spyglass, modified with special lenses that gathered what little light existed, making night observation possible for normal eyes. Rebecca had no need for such assistance, but she'd kept the device as a reminder of the engineer who had crafted it for her unit, a kind man who had been one of the few to know her secret. As she secured the weapon belt around her waist, Rebecca's thoughts turned to the layout of her property. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with the barn and chicken coop to the east, the spring house to the south, and dense woods beginning 30 yards to the north and west. A split-rail fence encircled the immediate yard, more as a boundary marker than a defensive structure. Her vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, lay fallow between the cabin and the spring house. She knew every inch of this land, every uneven stone in the pathway, every creaking board on the porch, every tree large enough to provide cover at the forest's edge. She had chosen this property precisely for its defensible position and multiple approach routes that she could navigate without light. The riders were closer now. Rebecca could hear the occasional snort of a horse, the creak of saddle leather. They had stopped short of the clearing, maintaining the cover of trees, not the approach of innocent travelers seeking shelter. Sheriff Hayes would be her natural ally, but his office was 8 miles away in Pinecrest, and the recent rains had left the connecting road in poor condition. Even if someone could be sent, help would be hours away. Rebecca Caldwell stood alone against whatever approached. She extinguished the last embers in the stove and fireplace, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. Most would be effectively blind in such conditions. For Rebecca, the absence of artificial light enhanced her unusual vision, the contours of her familiar surroundings becoming more distinct rather than less. Moving to her bedroom, she quickly changed into darker clothing, a black woolen shirt and trousers she had sewn herself, practical garments that scandalized the townswomen on the rare occasions they glimpsed them. The pants allowed freedom of movement that no dress could provide, and tonight mobility would be essential. She pulled on soft-soled boots, tied her hair more securely, and returned to the main room. The approaching men had reached the edge of her clearing. Rebecca could make out their forms through the window, 6 riders as she had initially counted, now dismounting and securing their horses among the trees. They moved with the confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. 2 carried rifles. The others appeared to have pistols. They were spreading out, surrounding the cabin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A ruthlessly practical part of Rebecca's mind noted the tactical advantage she now possessed. They believed they were approaching an ordinary widow's cabin under cover of darkness, with surprise on their side. They didn't realize that the darkness worked against them, not for them, that their movements were as visible to her as if they crossed an open field at noon. Rebecca took a position beside the front window where she could observe without being seen. The men had completed their encirclement of the cabin, moving with the coordinated efficiency of those who had performed similar operations before. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive wide-brimmed hat, gestured for 2 men to approach the front door while the others maintained positions covering potential escape routes. "Remember, this one's supposed to have medicines and such," she heard the leader say, his voice low but carrying in the mountain stillness. "Could fetch a good price from the right buyers. No shooting unless necessary." "What about the woman?" "Jackson?" asked one of the men, a stocky figure with a rifle slung across his back. "We'll see," replied the leader. "Jackson Preston," Rebecca presumed. "Might be useful to have a healer along for a while. If not, well, He left the implication hanging in the cold night air. Rebecca's expression hardened. She had spent 12 years building a peaceful life after seeing enough violence during the war to last several lifetimes. She had chosen isolation not out of fear, but because it offered simplicity, autonomy, and the freedom to use her unusual abilities without scrutiny or explanation. Now these men threatened everything she had. Carefully constructed, she moved silently to the door as the first heavy knock sounded, followed by a falsely friendly voice. "Hello, inside. Travelers seeking shelter from the cold night, might we warm ourselves by your fire, ma'am?" Rebecca stood to the side of the door, Remington now in hand, but held low. Her voice, when she responded, betrayed none of her awareness of their true intentions. "I'm afraid I'm not prepared for visitors this evening," she called through the door, injecting a note of timid concern that was entirely fabricated. The town of Pinecrest is just 8 miles south along the main road. They have a fine boarding house. A moment of silence followed, then a different voice, harsher, less patient. "Open up, woman. We ain't asking twice." "I cannot help you, sir," Rebecca responded, her tone firmer. "Please continue on your way." The men exchanged muttered words she couldn't quite catch, then footsteps retreated from the door. Rebecca knew this wasn't surrender. They were moving to their secondary plan. Moments later, she heard the sound of breaking glass as someone shattered one of her rear windows. Most defenders would now be dividing their attention, uncertain where the actual entry would occur, their effectiveness diminished by darkness and confusion. Rebecca, however, moved confidently through her darkened home, tracking each intruder's position by sound and glimpses through windows. The man at the rear was attempting to clear the broken glass from the window frame before climbing through. Another had moved to the side window, likely to create a second entry point. The leader and 2 others maintained positions at the front, expecting their quarry to flee toward them in panic once the rear attackers entered. Rebecca allowed herself a grim smile in the darkness. They had made a critical error in their assumptions about her and her abilities. Now she would use that misconception against them. Instead of cowering or fleeing, she moved purposefully toward the rear of the cabin, the Remington held ready. As the first man began to hoist himself through the broken window, Rebecca's voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The man froze halfway through the opening, squinting into what must have appeared to him as impenetrable blackness. "What the—" The distinctive click of Rebecca's revolver being cocked echoed in the small room. "Back out slowly," she instructed, her voice calm but leaving no room for negotiation. "Tell your friends that this cabin is not the easy target they imagined." The intruder hesitated, trying to locate her in the darkness. "I can't see a damn." "A thing," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Just a scared woman shooting blind. Boys, she's in here." Rebecca sighed. She had offered a chance for retreat. Now a demonstration was necessary. She fired once, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the room. The bullet splintered the window frame precisely 2 inches from the man's right hand, close enough to send a message, but deliberately avoiding injury. His reaction was immediate and profane. He scrambled backward, tumbling unceremoniously. Outside, "She can see in the dark," he shouted to his companions. "She almost took my hand off." Outside, she heard rapid movement and confused voices as the men registered this unexpected development. Rebecca used their momentary disorientation to move to another position, away from where the muzzle flash had revealed her location. "That was a warning," she projected her voice confidently. "The next one won't be." For a dozen heartbeats, silence reigned. Then Jackson Preston's voice carried from outside, its earlier false friendliness replaced with cold calculation. "Seems we've found ourselves an unusual widow," he called. "I'm impressed, ma'am. But you're still alone against 6, and we have your cabin surrounded. Why not be reasonable? We'll take what we came for and leave you unharmed." Rebecca moved to the front window, tracking Preston's position by his voice. In the darkness that rendered him nearly blind. She could see him clearly, tall and lean, standing confidently with one hand resting on his holstered pistol, the other holding a rifle at the ready. "You're making assumptions, Mr. Preston," she replied, satisfaction flickering briefly as she noted his startled reaction to her knowledge of his name. "First, that I'm alone. Second, that darkness works in your favor. Neither is correct." As if to emphasize her point, Rebecca raised her Remington and fired through the open window. The bullet knocked Preston's hat from his head with surgical precision. Before the echoes of the shot had faded, she had already moved to another window, anticipating the return fire that splintered the wood where she had stood moments before. Jesus. Night erupted into chaos as the Blackridge gang realized they faced an adversary unlike any they had encountered before. One who moved through darkness as confidently as they navigated daylight, who knew their positions despite their attempts at concealment, who struck with uncanny accuracy where they fired blindly. What none of them yet understood was that this night had only begun, and Rebecca Caldwell was in her element. The true reckoning would unfold in the coming hours, as a widow who saw better in darkness taught these men the cost of their terrible miscalculation. 3 days before the Blackridge gang arrived at her doorstep, Rebecca Caldwell had risen before dawn, as she did each morning. The October air bit with early frost as she kindled the stove fire and set water to boil. Her daily routine had remained largely unchanged for the past 12 years, a deliberate rhythm that provided structure to days that might otherwise blur together in isolation. Her connection to Pinecrest hadn't always been so distant. When she and Thomas first purchased the property after the war, they had envisioned a different life, perhaps children running across the clearing, regular trips to town for supplies and socializing, gradually becoming woven into the community's fabric. Thomas had been the gregarious one, quick with a smile and a story, while Rebecca had been content to stand in his shadow, her quiet nature mistaken for shyness rather than careful observation. Thomas's death from pneumonia, just 2 years after they settled, had altered that trajectory. Without his buffer between Rebecca and a world that had always regarded her as slightly strange, she gradually retreated into the solitude that felt more natural to her unique perception. As Rebecca prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and preserves, memories of Thomas surfaced unbidden. Unlike most who had known her during the war, he had embraced her unusual vision as a gift rather than an oddity or tactical advantage. "You see the world as God intended before he said, 'Let there be light,'" he once told her, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear or suspicion. Thomas had been a cavalry officer assigned to her scout unit, one of the few who knew the Shadow Scout was a woman. Their love had blossomed amid the chaos of war, their shared secrets creating an unbreakable bond. When peace came, he had protected her identity, understanding that the world wasn't ready to acknowledge a woman's contribution to covert operations. Rebecca placed her breakfast on the table next to her worn leather-bound journal. The pages contained meticulous records of her herbal preparations, seasonal cycles of wild plants, and observations of wildlife patterns, a testament to her methodical mind. What wasn't recorded were the nightmares that still occasionally plagued her sleep, images of soldiers following her through hostile territory, their lives in her hands, the consequences of a single misstep, catastrophic. After breakfast, Rebecca had tended to her morning chores, feeding chickens, checking her rabbit snares at the forest edge, harvesting the last hardy herbs from her garden before the first hard frost claimed them. She worked efficiently, her movements economical, nothing wasted. Years of self-sufficiency had honed practical skills that complemented her natural abilities. The previous spring, she had planted a new section of medicinal herbs, echinacea, valerian, and feverfew, expanding her healing capacity. Demand for her remedies had grown steadily as results spoke for themselves. Sheriff Hayes's chronic cough, which town Dr. Morrison had failed to treat effectively, had improved markedly with her specialty of mullein, wild cherry bark, and honey. Mrs. Patterson's arthritic hands found relief with Rebecca's salve, when expensive medicines ordered from Richmond provided no benefit. By mid-morning, Rebecca had moved to her workbench in the cabin, where dried plants hung from rafters in organized bundles. She began preparing tinctures, her fingers deftly separating leaves from stems, measuring precise amounts of dried herbs into bottles of alcohol to extract their medicinal properties. This work required concentration, but left room for reflection. Rebecca's thoughts drifted to her most recent visitor 3 days prior, young Jenny Miller, the blacksmith's daughter, who had arrived nervous and alone with a problem she couldn't take to her parents or the town doctor. "My monthly time hasn't come for 2 months, Miss Caldwell," she had whispered, eyes downcast, "and I've been sick in the mornings." Rebecca had asked gentle questions, confirming what she suspected. The father was Samuel Winters, a logging company surveyor passing through town who had made promises he clearly never intended to keep. Jenny was barely 17, unmarried, and terrified. "I can't have a baby," Jenny had pleaded. "My pa would kill me, and then Sam." Many herbalists in Rebecca's position might have offered pennyroyal or other dangerous abortifacients. Instead, she had taken the girl's hands in hers. "You have choices, Jenny, but I won't give you anything that might harm you," Rebecca had said, firmly. "That's not the kind of healing I practice." Instead, she had given Jenny ginger tea for the nausea and extracted a promise to return in 1 week to discuss options. Rebecca had connections in Harrisonburg, a midwife who sometimes placed unwanted babies with childless couples. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it offered a path forward that didn't begin with dangerous remedies or end with community ostracism. The interaction had reminded Rebecca of her own vulnerability as a woman alone. The townspeople tolerated her because they needed her skills, but that acceptance remained conditional. Strange women living alone had faced accusations of witchcraft within living memory in these mountains. Her unusual night vision, if widely known, would only feed such suspicions. Rebecca corked a bottle of tincture and labeled it with precise handwriting, "Willow bark, for fever and pain." She placed it on a shelf alongside dozens of similar preparations, her modest pharmacy that had earned her both respect and wariness from the people of Pinecrest. A sound outside had drawn her attention to the window, hoofbeats approaching along the rutted path to her cabin. Few visitors arrived unannounced, especially as winter threatened. Rebecca instinctively moved to the side of the window rather than standing directly before it, a habit from her scouting days that persisted despite years of peace. Sheriff Hayes appeared on horseback, his grey mare picking her way carefully through muddy patches. At 58, Hayes remained imposing, despite his greying hair and the slight stoop that had developed in recent years. He had been sheriff of Shenandoah County since the war's end, respected for his fairness, if not always for his methods. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch to greet him. "Sheriff Hayes, your cough medicine isn't due, and for another week." Hayes dismounted with a grunt, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Didn't come for medicine today, Miss Caldwell, though I'm grateful for what you provided. Breathing easier than I have in months." He removed his hat as he approached, a gesture of courtesy that Rebecca had noticed he reserved for few women in the county. "May I have a moment of your time?" Rebecca nodded, gesturing toward the porch chairs. "Of course. Would you care for tea?" "No, thank you, ma'am. This won't take long." Hayes settled his considerable frame into the chair, which creaked in protest. "I'm making rounds to outlying properties. Thought you should know there's been trouble moving this way." Rebecca sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. "What kind of trouble?" "The Blackridge gang. Started as petty thieves and road agents after the war, but they've graduated to more serious matters." Hayes's expression darkened. 5, maybe 6 men led by the Preston brothers. Been hitting isolated homesteads between here and Rockingham County. What are they after? Rebecca asked, though she suspected the answer. Anything of value they can carry. Money, jewelry, weapons. They've taken horses and livestock too. Hayes paused, his weathered face grave. They killed a farmer over in Crawford Hollow who tried to stop them. Shot him in front of his family. Rebecca absorbed this information, her expression revealing nothing. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. Hayes studied her for a moment. They're targeting remote properties, Ms. Caldwell, and yours is about as remote as they come in this county. I'm just a widow with herbs and chickens, Rebecca replied evenly. Hardly worth their effort. Begging your pardon, but that's not how they see it. Word gets around about your remedies. Some folks pay good money for that kind of healing. Hayes leaned forward, and a woman living alone. He left the implication unspoken. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. What would you suggest, Sheriff? Stay in town for a spell. The boarding house has rooms available. Would be safer until we apprehend these men. And who would tend my animals? My garden? The herbs that can't be harvested at the wrong time? Rebecca shook her head. The cabin suits me fine, Sheriff. I've weathered difficulties before. Hayes sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. At least accept this, then. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small revolver. It's a Remington double-action, reliable and easy to handle, 5 shots. Rebecca looked at the offered weapon without reaching for it. Few knew she already possessed a similar firearm, and had since her scouting days. I'm not sure I'd know how. To use such a thing effectively, she lied smoothly. Hayes placed it on the small table between them. Point and squeeze the trigger. At close range, you don't need to be a marksman. His eyes held genuine concern. Please, Ms. Caldwell. It would ease my conscience. Rebecca recognized the gesture for what it was. Not just protection, but respect. Hayes was one of the few people who treated her as capable rather than peculiar. She picked up the revolver, testing its weight. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep it close. She paused, then asked, how many have they harmed? 2 dead that we know of. Several injured. Hayes replaced his hat, preparing to leave. They're not just thieves, Miss Caldwell. They enjoy causing fear. The Preston brothers brought back habits from the war that have no place in peacetime. As he mounted his horse, Hayes added, I'll check on you when I can, but we're stretched thin. Just be watchful. I always am, Sheriff, Rebecca replied, the irony of her words lost on him. More than you know. After Hayes departed, Rebecca had spent the remainder of that day 3 days ago in contemplation, weighing her options. She could follow his advice and temporarily relocate to town, where the gang would be unlikely to strike. The logical choice, certainly. Yet the cabin wasn't. Merely shelter to Rebecca, it was sanctuary. Here, she could move through darkness without explaining her unusual ability. Here, the nightmares came less frequently. Here, she had forged a life on her own terms after years of hiding her true nature, and so she had made her decision, though not the one Hayes might have hoped for. Instead of packing for town, Rebecca had retrieved her trunk from beneath the bed, unlocking it with the key she wore always around her neck. The items within had remained largely untouched for years, remnants of a life she had set aside but never completely abandoned. The Remington revolver, larger and more worn than the one Hayes had offered, felt familiar in her hand. Rebecca checked its mechanism meticulously, cleaning and oiling each part before loading it with cartridges from a box that had gathered dust in one corner of the trunk. Next came the leather belt with pouches for additional ammunition, the hunting knife with its bone handle darkened from years of use, and finally the small tin of black powder, a special preparation she had once used to create diversions when leading soldiers through enemy territory. The spyglass with its modified lenses brought unexpected emotion as she lifted it from the false bottom of the trunk. Captain Lewis Monroe, the engineer who had crafted it, had been one of her few friends during those dark years. He had understood her vision wasn't just keen, but fundamentally different from others. "You're seeing frequencies the rest of us can't perceive, Rebecca," he had explained once, his scholarly enthusiasm momentarily overwhelming caution. "The human eye has limitations that yours somehow transcends." Monroe had died at Antietam, his brilliant mind lost to a Confederate minier. The spyglass remained his legacy, a tool that had saved countless lives by allowing ordinary soldiers to navigate darkness when she couldn't guide them all personally. Rebecca had placed these items strategically around her cabin: the revolver beneath a cushion in her rocking chair, the knife in a sheath attached to the underside of her work table, the spyglass and powder tin on a high shelf disguised among herb containers. The cavalry saber remained where it had always been, mounted above the fireplace, appearing decorative but maintained for function. Over the next 2 days, she had adjusted her routine. Rebecca started sleeping in shorter intervals during daylight, hours, remaining alert through the night. She reinforced the cabin's vulnerabilities, securing shutters more thoroughly, adding a wooden bar across the back door, moving furniture to create defensive positions if the need arose. The preparations were practical, but they awakened memories Rebecca had long suppressed. Nights spent guiding soldiers through Confederate territory, her vision allowing her to see sentries and obstacles invisible to others. The constant vigilance, knowing discovery, meant not just her death, but those of the men who depended on her. The weight of that responsibility had never fully left her, merely receded into the background of her quiet existence. One particular memory surfaced repeatedly as she worked: a midnight operation near Fredericksburg in the winter of 1863. Rebecca had been guiding a small unit of Union soldiers to rescue prisoners from a Confederate camp. Everything had proceeded according to plan until they encountered an unexpected patrol. In the chaos that followed, Rebecca had been forced to use her revolver for the first time, shooting a Confederate soldier who had detected their presence. Her aim, like her vision, had proven exceptional, a clean shot through the heart that ended his life instantly. Later, a young lieutenant had marveled at her marksmanship in near-total darkness. "It's like you can see things the rest of us can't, Private Ross." Her male alias had been necessary for the mission. "Just lucky, sir," she had responded, concealing how deeply the killing affected her despite its necessity. That night had marked a turning point. Rebecca realized her unique vision made her not just an exceptional scout, but potentially a deadly combatant when circumstances demanded. It was a capability she had used sparingly and reluctantly thereafter, but one she had honed nonetheless. Now, 12 years later, as she prepared for the possibility of confrontation at her isolated cabin, Rebecca acknowledged that the skills she had developed during war might once again prove necessary in peace. The Blackridge gang, should they appear, would expect to find a vulnerable widow, not a woman who had once navigated battlefield dangers with preternatural ability. By the third day, the day the gang would ultimately arrive, Rebecca had completed her preparations while maintaining her normal activities. She harvested herbs in the morning, tended her animals, and prepared remedies for patients who would receive them once the weather cleared enough for travel into town. To any observer, she appeared to be continuing her routine unaffected by Hayes's warning, yet her senses remained heightened, attuned to changes in her environment that might signal danger. The forest surrounding her property teemed with wildlife. Deer moved through the underbrush, squirrels chattered among the branches, birds announced territorial claims with melodious precision. Rebecca had learned to interpret these natural rhythms, recognizing that sudden silence often heralded human intrusion before any visual confirmation. That afternoon, she had noticed the first sign. The birds near the western property line had gone quiet for approximately 20 minutes before resuming their calls. Someone had passed through, taking care to remain unseen, scouting most likely, assessing the property and its occupant. Rebecca had continued grinding dried willow bark with her mortar and pestle, giving no outward indication she had detected anything unusual. But inwardly, she began preparing herself mentally for what might come. Not fear. She had moved beyond fear during those long-ago nights behind enemy lines, but focused readiness. As dusk approached, Rebecca completed her usual chores with deliberate normality. She fed the chickens, closed their coop against nocturnal predators, and brought in additional firewood for the night. She prepared and ate a simple supper, cleaned her few dishes, and lit lamps as darkness gathered. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a solitary woman, following the unremarkable routine of rural life. Only after full darkness fell did Rebecca extinguish most of the lamps, leaving a single one burning near the window, a signal to any observer that she was settling in for the evening. In reality, she had changed into her practical dark clothing and positioned her weapons for easy access. The main cabin room had been subtly rearranged to provide cover while maintaining clear paths to all entrances and exits. Rebecca sat in the darkness, her extraordinary vision rendering the familiar space in shades of grey and blue, where others would see only blackness. She waited with the patience she had cultivated during countless nights of surveillance, her breathing slow and controlled, her senses alert to the smallest changes in her environment. Hours passed. The quarter moon rose and set. The temperature dropped further, frost beginning to form on the edges of window panes. Normal night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a fox, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, created a natural symphony that Rebecca had learned to interpret as effectively as any written language. It was the absence of these sounds that ultimately alerted her to approaching danger. Shortly after midnight, the forest fell into unnatural silence. The wildlife had detected what human ears might miss, the presence of multiple intruders moving with purpose through the darkness. Rebecca rose silently from her chair, moving to the north-facing window. Her exceptional night vision immediately registered what confirmed her suspicions: the silhouettes of mounted men emerging from the tree line, approaching slowly with lanterns doused. 6 riders, their outlines distinct against the starlit sky, moving with the caution of predators stalking prey. The Blackridge gang had arrived. Rebecca felt a curious calm settle over her, the same focused clarity she had experienced during her most dangerous wartime missions. She reached for the revolver she had positioned nearby, checking it one final time before securing it at her waist. The hunting knife found its place in a sheath at her belt, and she tucked the tin of black powder into her pocket. As she prepared to meet the threat approaching through the darkness, Rebecca Caldwell allowed herself a moment of grim amusement. These men believed the night provided them cover and advantage. They had no way of knowing they had chosen to target a woman for whom darkness had always been an ally rather than an adversary. They were about to learn that some widows were far more dangerous than they appeared, especially those who saw better in darkness than most people did in daylight. Sheriff Daniel Hayes was not a man easily disturbed by violence. 20 years in law enforcement, 4 during the war and 16 after, had exposed him to humanity's capacity for cruelty. Yet something about the Blackridge gang's patterns left him unsettled as he rode back toward Pinecrest after warning Rebecca Caldwell. The setting sun stretched his shadow along the muddy road as he considered the widow's stubborn refusal to seek safety in town. Most women living alone would have jumped at the opportunity for protection. Most would have shown fear at his warnings. Rebecca Caldwell had displayed neither reaction, just that steady, penetrating gaze that always made Hayes feel she was seeing more than she let on. "Peculiar woman," he muttered to his horse, who flicked an ear in response. Hayes had first met Rebecca when she and her husband settled in the area 12 years ago. Thomas Caldwell had been friendly enough, a former Union cavalry officer with a quick smile and an easy manner that helped the couple integrate into the community despite lingering post-war tensions. Rebecca had been reserved even then, but Thomas's presence had softened her edges. After Thomas's death, she had withdrawn further, emerging from isolation only when her herbal remedies began drawing people to her door. Hayes himself had resisted, trying her treatments until conventional medicine failed to address his chronic cough. 3 weeks of her special tea had accomplished what expensive doctors could not. Hayes reined his horse to a stop at the crossroads where the path to Rebecca's cabin diverged from the main road to town. He turned in his saddle, studying the darkening forest that concealed her property from view. Something nagged at him, an instinct honed by years of tracking lawbreakers. The Blackridge gang had established a clear pattern in their raids across 3 counties. They targeted isolated properties, yes, but specifically those with visible signs of prosperity. Newly painted barns, quality livestock, evidence of commercial success. Rebecca's modest cabin, with its small garden and chicken coop, hardly fit their usual criteria, unless they knew something Hayes didn't. His thoughts turned to Jeremiah Blackwood, the storekeeper in Pinecrest who acted as unofficial postmaster and gossip central. Blackwood had mentioned several strangers passing through town in recent weeks, men asking unusual questions about local residents. "Showed particular interest in our local herb woman," Blackwood had said. "Wanted to know what she sells, who buys from her. Even asked if she lived alone." At the time, Hayes had attributed this to normal curiosity about a somewhat mysterious figure. Now he wondered if the Blackridge gang had been gathering intelligence before selecting their targets. Hayes nudged his horse toward town, his decision made. He would organize additional patrols near Rebecca's property over the coming days. The widow might refuse to leave her home, but he could at least increase vigilance in the area. The first stars appeared overhead as Hayes approached Pinecrest. The town consisted of little more than 2 intersecting dirt roads lined with wooden buildings. A church, general store, blacksmith, tavern, doctor's office, and scattered homes, most weathered by years of mountain seasons. Lanterns glowed in windows, creating pools of warm light against the gathering darkness. Hayes dismounted outside his office, a modest structure attached to the 2-cell jail that rarely housed more than the occasional drunk needing to sleep off his excesses. Inside, Deputy Mark Collins looked up from cleaning his revolver at the small desk. "Any trouble, Sheriff?" Collins asked, setting aside his oiling cloth. "Not yet," Hayes replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "But it's coming." Collins was young, just 24, but showed promise as a lawman. He had a level head in difficult situations and good instincts about people. Hayes had hired him 3 years earlier when the county approved funding for a deputy. "The Blackridge gang?" Collins asked. Hayes nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the small stove. "Made the rounds to outlying properties today. Most folks are taking precautions or coming to town until the danger passes. But not everyone," Collins guessed. "Rebecca Caldwell refuses to leave her cabin." Hayes took a seat at his desk, stretching his tired legs. "Stubborn woman." Collins' expression shifted subtly, something Hayes had noticed whenever the widow's name arose. The young deputy had developed an unspoken admiration for Rebecca after she treated his mother's rheumatism when Dr. Morrison had declared it untreatable. "She knows these mountains better than most," Collins offered. "Maybe she feels safer there than in town." Hayes grunted non-committally. "Being familiar with terrain doesn't stop bullets, Deputy." "True enough." Collins hesitated, then asked, "You think they'll actually hit her place?" "Doesn't seem their usual target. That's what concerns me," Hayes admitted. "They've been asking questions about her in town. Specific questions." Collins frowned. "Her remedies, you think? I've heard some of her tinctures fetch good prices." "Possibly." Hayes sipped his coffee. "Or maybe they've heard rumors about Thomas Caldwell's war service. Some veterans came home with valuables acquired during campaigns." "You think she has something worth stealing?" "She lives simply." "Appearances can be deceiving," Hayes replied. "But whatever their interest, I don't like it." The sheriff rose and moved to the crude map of Shenandoah County tacked to the wall. He traced the distance between town and Rebecca's property with his finger. "I want extra patrols in this area for the next week," he said. "Ride by her place. Twice daily, but be subtle about it. Don't make it obvious we're watching." Collins nodded. "I'll take the morning rounds." "Good. I'll handle evenings." Hayes turned from the map. "And send word to Sheriff Bryson in Rockingham County. The gang crossed into our jurisdiction 3 days ago, according to reports. He should know." After Collins departed to deliver the message, Hayes settled behind his desk to document the day's activities in the county ledger. As he wrote, his thoughts returned to Rebecca Caldwell and her unusual demeanor. Most women, most men for that matter, would show some fear when warned of violent outlaws targeting the area. Rebecca had seemed almost prepared. Not for the first time, Hayes wondered about the widow's past. Thomas had been forthcoming about his war service, but Rebecca rarely spoke of her life before arriving in Virginia. Hayes had assumed she came from a sheltered background, perhaps a merchant's daughter unused to rural isolation until marriage brought her to the mountains. Yet occasionally he glimpsed something else in her manner, a watchfulness, an awareness of surroundings that reminded him more of veteran scouts than genteel womanhood, the way she always positioned herself with clear sightlines to exits. The way she moved, quietly and efficiently, wasting no motion. Hayes shook his head, dismissing the thoughts as fanciful. Rebecca was simply a woman who had adapted to life alone after losing her husband. Nothing more mysterious than that. Still, as he completed his log entry, Hayes made a note to increase patrols near her property from twice daily to 3 times, including one after midnight. Something told him the Blackridge gang might strike sooner rather than later. 30 miles away, in a hunting cabin borrowed from a sympathetic former Confederate, Jackson Preston watched his brother Edwin clean a Colt revolver with methodical precision. The cabin's single room was illuminated by lantern light, revealing 4 other men sprawled on bedrolls or seated at the rough-hewn table. Whiskey bottles and playing cards provided entertainment while they finalized plans. At 38, Jackson was the eldest of the Preston brothers and unquestioned leader of the Blackridge gang. Tall and lean with prematurely graying hair, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. The war had taught him valuable lessons about strategy, intimidation, and the expendability of human life. Lessons he had applied profitably in the chaotic post-war years. "Michaels came back with the report?" Edwin asked, without looking up from his weapon. 3 years younger than Jackson, Edwin shared his brother's height, but had a wiry strength that made him quicker in a fight. "Returned an hour ago," Jackson confirmed, taking a seat opposite his brother. "The Caldwell woman is exactly where we expected. Cabins isolated, good cover for approach, minimal defenses." "Any visitors?" "Just the sheriff earlier today." "Probably warning her about us." Jackson's mouth curved in a humorless smile. Too little, too late. Edwin slid the cleaned revolver into his holster. "What about neighbors?" "Nearest is 3 miles away. By the time anyone hears anything and alerts the sheriff in town, we'll be long gone." At the table, Levi Michaels, the gang's youngest member at 25, looked up from his cards. "Still don't understand what's so special about this widow. We passed 3 better-looking properties on the way here. Jackson exchanged a glance with Edwin. The others didn't need to know everything, just enough to follow orders. "She's not just any widow," Jackson explained. "The woman's got a reputation as a healer. People pay good money for her remedies, cash money which she keeps at the cabin." This was partially true. Rebecca's herbal preparations had indeed created a modest income stream, though Jackson doubted she kept substantial cash on hand. But the real prize remained something he had shared only with Edwin. Michael seemed satisfied with the explanation, returning to his card game with Silas Turner and the Fowler brothers, Daniel and Joseph. All four were Confederate veterans who had found civilian life less profitable than outlawry. None asked too many questions, as long as they received their share of takings. When the men were again absorbed in their game, Edwin moved closer to Jackson, lowering his voice. "You still believe the rumors?" Jackson nodded slightly. "Captain William Harrison confirmed it before we left Lexington. He served with Thomas Caldwell in the 7th Virginia Cavalry, and he's certain about what Caldwell brought home. Harrison saw it himself at the officers' quarters after Fredericksburg. Said Caldwell kept it wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in his saddlebags, planned to secure his future with it after the war." Edwin whistled softly. "Confederate Treasury certificates, genuine ones, not the counterfeits floating around. 30 of them, according to Harrison. Face value of $1,000 each." Jackson's eyes gleamed in the lantern light, worth at least half that to the right buyers, even now. "If they exist," Edwin cautioned, "and if his widow knows where they're hidden." "She knows." Jackson's tone left no room for doubt. "Woman like that, living alone all these years, surviving without remarrying, she's got resources we don't see." Edwin studied his brother's face. "And if she refuses to tell us?" Jackson's expression hardened. "Everyone talks eventually when properly motivated." The conversation shifted as Jackson unrolled a crude map of the area on the table. He had sketched it based on Michael's reconnaissance of Rebecca's property earlier that day. "We move tomorrow night," Jackson announced, loud enough for all to hear. "New moon, good cloud cover predicted. We'll approach from the west, using the tree line for cover." The men gathered around as Jackson detailed each person's role in the operation. The plan was straightforward. Surround the cabin, 2 men at the rear, 2 covering potential escape routes, Jackson and Edwin at the front door. Standard intimidation tactics had worked well in previous raids. A lone woman would likely surrender quickly when confronted by 6 armed men. "What about the sheriff?" Turner asked. "Michael said he visited her today." "Hayes is predictable," Jackson replied dismissively. "He'll increase patrols for a few days, but they're undermanned. 2 men can't cover the whole county effectively." "Still," Edwin interjected, "best to move quickly. Get in, find what we need, and clear out before dawn." Jackson nodded agreement. "No unnecessary violence," he instructed, looking pointedly at Daniel Fowler, who had developed a reputation for excessive force. "We need the widow cooperative, not injured." "And after she cooperates?" Fowler asked, a disturbing eagerness in his voice. Jackson silenced him with a cold stare. "We're thieves, not murderers, unless circumstances require it." The unspoken message was clear. Jackson alone would determine when killing became necessary. As the men returned to their whiskey and cards, Jackson stepped outside the cabin, needing air and solitude to finalize details in his mind. The night. Air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, the forest around them silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. The Blackridge gang had operated successfully for 3 years by following strict protocols: thorough reconnaissance, careful target selection, rapid execution, and clean escape. They had developed a fearsome reputation while suffering minimal casualties. Only once had they killed during a robbery, when a stubborn farmer had drawn a shotgun rather than surrender his strongbox. Rebecca Caldwell presented an unusual target, a lone woman with no obvious wealth. If Jackson hadn't received specific intelligence about Thomas Caldwell's hidden certificates, he would have bypassed her property entirely. But $30,000 in negotiable Confederate securities justified the risk, especially given the isolated location. What concerned Jackson wasn't the operation itself, but what might come after. If the certificates existed and they successfully acquired them, the Black Ridge Gang would become too notorious to continue operating in Virginia. They would need to move west, perhaps to the territories where law enforcement remained stretched. Thin and questions about sudden prosperity were less common. Edwin joined him outside, offering a cigarette which Jackson accepted. They smoked in companionable silence for several minutes, brothers united by blood and criminal enterprise. "You're thinking about after," Edwin finally said. Not a question, but an observation. Jackson exhaled smoke into the cool night air. "Colorado, maybe, or New Mexico territory, somewhere the name Preston isn't known. The others won't all come. They don't need to." Jackson's voice hardened. "We keep the full share between us, set them up with enough to start fresh elsewhere." Edwin nodded slowly, understanding the implication. The current gang configuration had served its purpose, but $30,000 changed calculations significantly. "Turner might be worth keeping," he suggested. "He's steady under pressure." "Perhaps." Jackson flicked his cigarette into the darkness. "Decisions for another day. First, we acquire the certificates." "And the widow." Jackson was silent for a moment. Rebecca Caldwell's fate hadn't featured prominently in his planning. She was an obstacle to overcome, nothing more. Dead or alive made little difference to him, though he preferred to avoid unnecessary killing when possible. Not from moral qualms, but pragmatic concerns about manhunts and increased bounties. "We'll see," he finally replied. "Depends on her, cooperation and what she sees." Edwin accepted this with a nod. The brothers had long ago established their boundaries. Jackson made the final decisions, Edwin enforced them, and neither questioned the occasional necessity of silencing witnesses. As they returned to the cabin, Jackson's thoughts turned to Rebecca Caldwell, wondering what kind of woman maintained such isolation by choice. Most widows either remarried or moved to town for safety and community. Her independence suggested unusual self-reliance, perhaps even stubbornness. These qualities might complicate their task tomorrow night. But in Jackson's experience, even the strongest will could be broken with proper application of fear and pain. The widow would reveal her secrets one way or another. The day before the Black Ridge Gang's arrival, Levi Michaels had indeed scouted Rebecca's property, as Jackson reported. Dressed as a traveling peddler, with a small pack of trinkets and notions, he had approached her cabin shortly after noon, maintaining the pretense of selling sewing supplies and small luxuries to isolated homesteads. Rebecca had recognized the deception immediately. The man's pack was too light for a genuine peddler, his questions too pointed, his eyes too calculating as they assessed her home's layout and defenses. She had played along, however, maintaining the facade of an unassuming widow with little to offer beyond modest hospitality. "Don't get many travelers this far from the main road," she had remarked, offering him water but not inviting him inside. They had conversed on her porch, Rebecca carefully positioning herself to block his view of the cabin's interior. "Times are hard," Michaels had replied with practiced humility. "Have to go where others don't to make my living. Not much market here, I'm afraid. Just myself, and I have little need for trinkets." His eyes had lingered on her herb bundles drying from the porch rafters. "I hear you're known for healing. Make good money selling remedies, they say." Rebecca had smiled thinly. "Barely enough to sustain myself. Most pay in eggs or flour rather than coin." The conversation had continued in this vein, him probing for information about her finances and routine, her providing minimal details while observing his reactions. When he finally departed without making a single sale, Rebecca had watched him follow the path back to the main road, noting that he moved with military precision despite his civilian disguise. After he disappeared from view, she had walked her property's perimeter, checking for signs that he might have left someone behind or marked the location for later reference. Near the western edge, she discovered freshly broken branches and a small cairn of 3 stacked stones. Not a natural formation, but a marker visible to those who knew to look for it. Rebecca had left it undisturbed. Better to let potential intruders believe their preparations remained undetected than to alert them to her awareness. That evening, she had made final adjustments to her defenses. The cabin's construction offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. Built of thick oak, logs chinked with clay, the walls would stop most bullets, but the windows, while small, provided potential entry points. Rebecca had subtly reinforced the shutters, positioning furniture to create defensive positions with clear fields of fire toward each opening. She had also prepared several special items from her rarely used collection of scout tools. Small packets of oil-soaked cloth that could be ignited for momentary illumination. Thin tripwires that, when disturbed, would ring the small bells she normally used to deter deer from her garden. A pouch of caltrops, sharp 4-pointed metal stars that could puncture boots or horse hooves when scattered on the ground. These preparations complete, Rebecca had conducted a final inventory of her weapons. The Remington revolver Hayes had given her remained visible on her bedside table, bait for intruders who might think it her only defense. Her own revolver, the hunting knife, and the cavalry saber were positioned strategically throughout the cabin, ensuring she would have access to a weapon regardless of where confrontation occurred. As darkness fell, Rebecca had settled into the rocking chair on her porch, appearing to enjoy the evening air while actually conducting a final survey of her surroundings. The forest seemed peaceful, wildlife moving in normal patterns, no sign of immediate threat. Yet her instincts, honed during wartime scouting, whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. Sometime during the night or the following day, men would come with violent intentions. They believed they sought an easy target, a solitary woman vulnerable in her isolation. What they would find instead was a prepared adversary with unique advantages they couldn't anticipate. Rebecca had lived 12 years of peace since the war ended. She had built a life centered on healing rather than harming, yet the skills that had made her an exceptional scout remained intact, merely dormant, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to germinate. As she rocked gently on her porch, Rebecca reminded herself that violence, when necessary for survival, was not a betrayal of her current path, but an unfortunate intersection with her past. The Blackridge gang had chosen this confrontation, not her. She would defend her home and herself with whatever means proved necessary. When true darkness fell, Rebecca had retired inside, maintaining the appearance of normal routine while completing her final preparations. She had slept in short intervals, training from her scout days, allowing her to rest while remaining partially alert to changes in her environment. Now, as midnight approached and she detected the first signs of the gang's arrival, Rebecca felt a familiar calm settle over her, the focused readiness that had kept her alive during countless dangerous missions. She moved silently through her darkened cabin, extinguishing the last lamp that had been visible from outside. In the absolute darkness that followed, Rebecca's extraordinary vision activated fully. Where others would see impenetrable blackness, she perceived shapes and movements with startling clarity, the contours of furniture, the texture of wooden walls, the subtle differences between deeper and lighter shadows. This unusual ability, once considered a curse by superstitious relatives, later a tactical advantage by military commanders. now represented her greatest asset against approaching danger. The Blackridge gang believed darkness would conceal their movements and disorient their target. They were about to discover how profoundly wrong that assumption would prove. 8 miles from Rebecca Caldwell's isolated cabin, the town of Pinecrest prepared for nightfall with the usual rituals of a small mountain community. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, casting pools of warm light onto the muddy main street. The general store closed its doors as Jeremiah Blackwood completed the day's final transactions. At the tavern, miners and loggers gathered for evening meals and drinks, their boisterous conversations a counterpoint to the quiet settling over the rest of the town. Dr. Morrison emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, to make a final house call before retiring. The blacksmith Walter Miller extinguished his forge for the night, the hiss of hot metal meeting water marking the transition from work to rest. The church stood dark and silent, awaiting Sunday's congregation. Deputy Mark Collins stepped onto the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, buttoning his coat against the evening chill. At 24, he carried his badge with earnest pride, determined to prove himself worthy of Sheriff Hayes's mentorship. His sandy hair and boyish features often led strangers to underestimate him, a misconception he had learned to use to his advantage. Collins surveyed the darkening street mentally, noting each person's movements and behaviors, a habit Hayes had instilled in him from his first day as deputy. Nothing seemed unusual, yet an undercurrent of tension had permeated Pinecrest since news of the Blackridge gang's proximity had spread. He crossed to the general store just as Blackwood was locking up. The storekeeper nodded in greeting, his round face ruddy in the lantern light. "Evening, Deputy. Sheriff back from his rounds? Returned a few hours ago," Collins confirmed. "Any strangers through town today?" Blackwood shook his head. "Quiet day, just the usual customers." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "People are talking, though, about the gang. What are they saying?" "That the Blackridge boys hit a farm near Johnson's Creek 3 days ago, took everything of value and left the family tied up in their barn." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Could have been worse, I suppose." Collins nodded grimly. The gang's reputation for escalating violence was well established. "Sheriff's organizing additional patrols. I'll be riding out at first light to check on outlying properties." "Including the Caldwell woman?" Blackwood asked, a hint of curiosity in his tone. "Among others," Collins replied neutrally, not wanting to confirm any specific focus on Rebecca's property. Blackwood seemed to sense his reticence. "Strange woman, that one. Keeps to herself mostly. Comes to town only when absolutely necessary." He adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully, "though I can't deny her remedies work wonders. My wife's migraines haven't returned since she started taking that willow bark tincture." Collins made a non-committal sound. Many in Pinecrest held similar views about Rebecca Caldwell, a mixture of appreciation for her healing skills and discomfort with her self-imposed isolation. "Well, good night, Deputy," Blackwood said, tucking his store keys into his vest pocket. "Tell the sheriff we're grateful for the extra vigilance." After Blackwood departed, Collins continued his patrol of the main street, exchanging brief greetings with townspeople hurrying to complete final errands before full darkness descended. The conversation with the storekeeper had reminded him of something that had been nagging at his mind throughout the day. 3 weeks earlier, a stranger had spent several days in Pinecrest, a man calling himself James Wilson, who claimed to be surveying potential logging sites for an Eastern company. He had asked numerous questions about local properties, showing particular interest in Rebecca Caldwell's remedies and clientele. At the time, Collins had thought nothing of it, but now, with the Blackridge gang's presence confirmed in the area, the coincidence seemed suspicious. He changed direction, heading toward the tavern where Wilson had stayed during his visit. The establishment occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building, with rented rooms above. Warm light and raucous laughter spilled from its windows as Collins climbed the steps and pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was crowded, but not packed. About 15 men occupied the tables, most focused on cards, whiskey, or both. Martha Simmons, the owner's wife, managed the bar with efficient authority, her grey, streaked hair secured in a practical bun. She nodded to Collins as he approached. "Evening, Deputy. Looking for trouble or avoiding it?" The question came with a smile that softened her weathered features. "Just making my rounds," Collins replied. "Wondered if I might ask you about a guest. From a few weeks back, James Wilson said he was a surveyor." Martha's smile faded slightly. "I remember him. Quiet, kept to himself, except when asking questions." She lowered her voice, leaning closer across the bar. "Between us, I didn't believe that surveyor story for a minute. Hands were too soft, and he never once produced a map or equipment. What kind of questions was he asking? Mostly about properties outside town, who owned what, whether they were prosperous." Martha frowned in recollection. "Had a particular interest in the Caldwell woman. Wanted to know if she had family visitors, how often she came to town, whether she seemed to have money." Collins felt his suspicions solidify. "Did he ask about other isolated homesteads too?" "That's the curious thing. Not really. Seemed focused. On her specifically." Martha wiped the bar absently with a cloth. "I figured maybe he had a sick relative and was investigating her healing reputation. But looking back, did he meet with anyone while he was here? Any private conversations you noticed?" Martha considered this. "Can't say for certain, but he spent quite a bit of time at this end of the bar talking with Sam Reynolds." She gestured toward a corner table where a heavy-set man played cards with 3 companions. "They seemed acquainted, though Sam claimed otherwise when I asked later." Collins's interest sharpened. Sam Reynolds had a questionable reputation in Pinecrest. Not quite criminal, but perpetually adjacent to trouble. He worked sporadically at the lumber mill while supplementing his income through gambling and occasional guide services for hunters unfamiliar with the mountains. "Thanks, Martha. That's helpful." Collins placed a coin on the bar. "Don't mention our conversation to Reynolds if you can avoid it." Martha nodded understanding, pocketing the coin. "Be careful, Deputy. Reynolds has friends you don't see around town much." Collins departed the tavern with a growing sense of unease. If Wilson had been gathering intelligence for the Blackridge gang, and if Reynolds had provided local knowledge, Rebecca Caldwell's property might be more firmly in their sights than even Hayes had suspected. He quickened his pace back to the sheriff's office, finding Hayes at his desk reviewing wanted posters by lamplight. The sheriff looked up as Collins entered, noting his deputy's concerned expression. "Something happen?" Hayes asked, setting aside the papers. Collins relayed his conversation with Martha, connecting it to Blackwood's earlier mention of strangers, asking about Rebecca. "I think they've been planning this for weeks, not days," he concluded, "and they've had help from Reynolds." Hayes absorbed this information, his expression hardening. "That fits with something that's been bothering me. The gang's usual targets are properties with visible wealth, farms with good livestock, businesses with predictable cash. The Caldwell place doesn't match their pattern." "Unless they know something we don't," Collins suggested. "Exactly." Hayes rose, moving to the gun cabinet where he selected a Winchester rifle and began loading it. "I'm riding out there tonight. Sheriff's instinct tells me we don't have until morning." "I'll come with you," Collins offered immediately. Hayes shook his head. "Someone needs to stay in town. If I'm wrong and they hit elsewhere, Pinecrest can't be left unprotected." He checked the rifle's action, then secured additional ammunition in his saddlebags. "If I'm not back by dawn, gather whoever you can trust and follow. Bring Dr. Morrison too." The implication hung in the air between them, that medical attention might be necessary, whether for Rebecca or Hayes himself. Collins wanted to argue, but recognized the logic in Hayes's decision. Dividing their minimal forces was risky, but leaving either the town or Rebecca completely vulnerable would be worse. "Yes, sir," Collins agreed reluctantly, "but fire 2 shots if you need immediate backup. I'll hear it if I'm on patrol." Hayes nodded, donning his heavy coat and hat. "Keep a close eye on Reynolds, too. If he leaves town suddenly, that could signal the gangs moving in." After Hayes departed, Collins returned to the main street, his senses heightened by new awareness of potential danger. The town had grown quieter as evening deepened, most residents now secured in their homes. A few windows still glowed with lamplight, silhouettes moving behind curtains as families prepared for bed. His patrol route took him past the tavern again, where he paused, remaining in shadows as he observed the patrons through the windows. Sam Reynolds was still at his corner table, now deep in a poker game that appeared to involve significant stakes based on the pile of coins before him. Collins considered confronting Reynolds directly about his connection to Wilson, but tactical sense prevailed. If Reynolds was indeed coordinating with the Blackridge gang, alerting him to law enforcement suspicions might accelerate their timeline or change their approach, potentially making the situation more dangerous for Rebecca and Hayes. Instead, Collins positioned himself where he could monitor the tavern's entrance without being obvious. If Reynolds departed suddenly, especially heading in the direction of Rebecca's property, that would confirm their suspicions and necessitate immediate action. As he maintained his vigilance, Collins reflected on the few interactions he'd had with Rebecca Caldwell since becoming deputy. Most had been brief encounters when she visited town for supplies, though she had spent considerable time with his mother, teaching her how to prepare and apply the rheumatism salve that had proven so effective. On one occasion, Collins had delivered a message to her cabin from Hayes, a warning about a mountain lion sighted in the area. Rebecca had thanked him for the information, then surprised him by offering specific advice about how to track and avoid the animal if encountered during patrols. Her knowledge of wildlife behavior had been impressively detailed, and she'd demonstrated an unexpected familiarity with firearms when she spotted the new Colt revolver Hayes had issued him. "Good weapon," she had commented. "Reliable action, minimal jamming if kept clean. 8-inch barrel gives you accuracy at distance, but watch. The kick on the second shot tends to pull up and right." When Collins had expressed surprise at her assessment, Rebecca had simply smiled faintly and mentioned that her late husband had owned similar firearms. But something in her demonstration of knowledge had suggested personal experience rather than second-hand familiarity. Now, watching the tavern while considering potential threats to Rebecca's safety, Collins wondered what other capabilities the quiet widow might possess that weren't immediately apparent to casual observation. Down the street from the tavern, in Pinecrest's small medical office, Dr. James Morrison organized his supplies with methodical precision. At 59, Morrison had served as the town's only physician for nearly 2 decades, arriving shortly after the war with his medical expertise and a deepening laudanum dependency that he had managed to overcome only in recent years. Unlike some doctors who resented competing remedies, Morrison had developed a respectful, if distant, professional relationship with Rebecca Caldwell. He recognized the efficacy of certain herbal treatments, particularly for chronic conditions that conventional medicine struggled to address. For acute emergencies, broken bones, bullet wounds, difficult childbirths, patients came to him. For persistent ailments like arthritis, respiratory issues, and digestive complaints, many sought Rebecca's gentler alternatives. Morrison packed his medical bag with extra supplies, additional bandages, suture materials, morphine for pain management, and instruments for bullet extraction. Hayes had visited earlier, requesting he remain available for potential emergency call-out, without specifying details. The doctor had served long enough in both civilian and military contexts to read between the lines, Violence was anticipated, casualties possible. As he worked, Morrison considered what he knew of the Blackridge gang from newspaper accounts and stories carried by travelers. Their pattern of escalating brutality concerned him professionally. Early robberies had been relatively bloodless affairs, property taken, victims restrained, but largely unharmed. Recent incidents involved beatings, torture for information about valuables, and in 2 confirmed cases, murder. The gang's evolving methods suggested psychological deterioration among its leadership, a phenomenon Morrison had observed in certain soldiers during the war, where initial reluctance to harm gradually transformed into eagerness, then hunger for inflicting pain. Such progression rarely reversed without intervention. Morrison closed his medical bag, mentally reviewing treatment protocols for various injuries, gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, lacerations. He hoped his preparations would prove unnecessary, but experience had taught him that hope made a poor strategic plan. A knock at his door interrupted these thoughts. Morrison opened it to find Walter Miller, the blacksmith, standing on his porch, hat in hands. "Evening, Doctor. Sorry to disturb. You so late?" "Not at all, Walter. Is someone ill?" Miller shook his head. "No, nothing like that. Deputy Collins mentioned you might be needed for an emergency involving the Blackridge gang. Thought you could use some support if it comes to that." Morrison studied the blacksmith's expression, noting the determination beneath his typically reserved demeanor. At 45, Miller remained powerfully built from years at the forge, his strength lending weight to his offer. "Come in," Morrison said, stepping aside, "though I hope Collins is being overly cautious." Miller entered, declining the offered chair in favor of standing near the window that overlooked the main street. "Sheriff rode out alone toward the Caldwell place," he said quietly. "Seems foolhardy if he expects trouble." "Hayes makes his decisions based on experience," Morrison replied, though privately he shared the blacksmith's concern. "His priority is protecting as many people as possible with limited resources. That's why I'm here." Miller's voice held firm conviction. "I've got no badge, but I can handle a rifle and ride a horse. If something happens, you'll need protection to do your work." Morrison hadn't considered this aspect, that his own safety might be compromised when treating potential victims. The offer made tactical sense. A doctor under fire could help no one. "I appreciate that, Walter. Let's hope it doesn't come to it." Miller nodded, his gaze returning to the darkened street. "My Jenny thinks highly of Ms. Caldwell, you know. Says she treated her with kindness when she needed help recently." He didn't elaborate on the nature of his daughter's problem, but his tone suggested significant gratitude. Morrison recalled Rebecca's handling of delicate situations with young women in the community, always discreet, non-judgmental, focused on health rather than moral pronouncements. Her approach differed markedly from some of the town's more rigid citizens who viewed unmarried pregnancy as unredeemable disgrace rather than a medical condition requiring compassionate care. "She's an unusual woman," Morrison acknowledged, "keeps to herself, yet helps others without hesitation when needed." "Folks don't always understand those who are different," Miller replied, an edge of personal knowledge in his voice. As the town's only black business owner, he had experienced his share of prejudice despite his essential skills. Sometimes being apart from others is safer than being among them. The observation hung in the air between them, an insight into Rebecca's isolation that few in Pinecrest had considered. Perhaps her withdrawal wasn't purely grief for her husband, but a conscious choice to avoid scrutiny or judgment for aspects of herself that didn't conform to expectations. Morrison changed the subject to practical matters. "If we're called out, we'll need fast transportation. My buggy is comfortable but slow." "Already arranged," Miller assured him. "Got my wagon prepared with blankets for any injured. Smoother. Who ride than horseback for returning to town. The doctor nodded approval. Miller had anticipated needs he hadn't yet considered, a testament to the blacksmith's practical intelligence. Let's establish a signal system with Collins. We should know immediately if Hayes encounters trouble. As they settled in to wait for developments, Morrison found himself wondering what Rebecca Caldwell might be facing in her isolated cabin. If the Blackridge gang had indeed targeted her specifically, what resources did she have to defend herself against 6 violent men? Hayes had mentioned providing her with a small revolver, but a single firearm would offer limited protection against multiple attackers. Rebecca's remote location, initially chosen for privacy and access to wild medicinal plants, now represented her greatest vulnerability. By the time any help could reach her from town, whatever confrontation occurred would likely be long concluded. Morrison could only hope that Hayes's instincts had led him to intercept the danger before it reached her door. Otherwise, his medical skills might soon be tested in ways he hadn't faced since battlefield hospitals during the war's darkest days. The forests surrounding Pinecrest had fallen into the deep silence of a mountain night, broken only by occasional owl calls and the distant howl of a solitary wolf. Along the rutted road connecting town to outlying properties, Sheriff Hayes urged his horse forward at a cautious trot, balancing speed against the risk of injury on the uneven terrain. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting strange, moving shadows across the path that Hayes's experienced eye distinguished from actual threats. He carried his Winchester across his saddle, ready for immediate use if needed, while his revolver remained holstered at his hip. Hayes had served as sheriff long enough to develop instincts about impending violence, subtle atmospheric shifts that preceded trouble, like the pressure drop before a storm. Tonight, those instincts screamed warnings he couldn't ignore, particularly regarding Rebecca Caldwell's vulnerability. The connections Collins had uncovered between the mysterious Wilson, local troublemaker Sam Reynolds, and targeted questions about Rebecca suggested coordination and specific intent rather than random targeting. Hayes had seen such patterns before, intelligence gathering preceding carefully planned robbery rather than opportunistic theft. What troubled him most was the question that had haunted him throughout his ride. What did the Blackridge gang believe Rebecca possessed that warranted such preparation? Her remedies, while valuable to those who used them, hardly constituted wealth worth considerable risk. She lived simply, with few visible luxuries that might tempt hardened criminals, unless they knew something about her, or her late husband, that Hayes himself didn't. Thomas Caldwell had been forthcoming about his military service when the couple first arrived in the area, sharing stories of cavalry campaigns that matched official accounts. He had mentioned receiving a modest pension for his contributions, explaining their ability to purchase the remote property, but had never displayed evidence of unusual wealth. After Thomas's death, Rebecca had maintained the property through a combination of selling herbal remedies and careful management of resources. Hayes had occasionally offered assistance, which she invariably declined with polite firmness. "I manage well enough, Sheriff," was her standard response, accompanied by that steady gaze that always left him feeling slightly off balance. Hayes guided his horse around a fallen branch, blocking part of the road, his thoughts circling back to the present danger. He estimated Rebecca's cabin lay about 3 miles ahead, close enough that he should reach it before any likely attack, assuming the Blackridge gang maintained their pattern of striking in pre-dawn hours when sleep was deepest. As he rounded a bend in the road, Hayes abruptly reined his horse to a stop, senses alert to a change in the environment he couldn't immediately identify. He listened intently, filtering natural forest sounds from potential human activity. For several long moments, nothing seemed amiss. Then he detected it, the faint metallic jingle of tack and bridle, quickly muffled, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Someone was on the road between him and Rebecca's cabin, attempting to move quietly and not entirely succeeding. Hayes dismounted silently, leading his horse into the cover of trees beside the road. He secured the animal to a low branch, then checked his weapons, Winchester fully loaded, revolver accessible, hunting knife secure in its sheath. Keeping to the shadows, he began moving forward on foot, using skills honed during wartime reconnaissance to minimize sound. The forest floor was damp from recent rain, reducing the likelihood of telltale crackling leaves or snapping twigs. Hayes advanced, slowly, stopping frequently to listen and assess. The sound didn't repeat, but his certainty of human presence only strengthened as he detected the distinctive odor of tobacco smoke, a slim tendril carried on the night breeze. Approximately 50 yards ahead, the road curved sharply around a large boulder formation that local residents called Preacher's Pulpit, due to its rough resemblance to a church lectern. The natural feature created an excellent point for ambush or surveillance of approaching travelers. Hayes suspected someone was positioned there, watching the road from both directions. The question was whether this sentry was connected to the Blackridge gang, and if so, whether Hayes had been fortunate enough to intercept them before they reached Rebecca's property or was already too late. Moving with practiced stealth through the underbrush parallel to the road, Hayes approached the boulder formation from an oblique angle that would allow him to observe without immediately being seen. The terrain grew rockier, requiring careful foot placement to avoid dislodging loose stones that might betray his position. As he neared the outcropping, Hayes caught glimpses of movement, a human figure seated on horseback in the shadows of the largest boulder, positioned to monitor the road, while remaining nearly invisible to anyone approaching directly. The sentry had chosen his position well, suggesting military experience or professional criminal methodology. Hayes raised his Winchester, sighting carefully along the barrel as he considered his options. Confrontation seemed inevitable, but the manner of engagement remained his choice. A warning shot might alert Rebecca to danger, but would sacrifice his element of surprise against what could be multiple opponents. Direct challenge risked immediate violence, but maintained tactical control. Before he could decide, the sentry shifted position, revealing his profile in a momentary patch of moonlight. Hayes recognized the distinctive hat and posture of Edwin Preston, Jackson's younger brother and second in command of the Blackridge gang. The sheriff's blood ran cold with sudden certainty. If Edwin was positioned as sentry, the main force was already advancing on Rebecca's cabin. Hayes had not intercepted them before their arrival. He had stumbled upon their rear guard. Any hope of peaceful resolution evaporated with this realization. The Blackridge gang had committed to their operation, and Rebecca Caldwell now faced immediate danger without knowing help was still miles away. Hayes adjusted his aim, centered on Edwin Preston's torso, and prepared to announce his presence with lead rather than words. The time for Sheriff's warnings had passed. This had become a matter of survival, both his own and Rebecca's. Jackson Preston signaled to his men with practiced hand gestures as they approached the clearing surrounding Rebecca Caldwell's cabin. The night wrapped around them like a cloak, moonless, cloud-covered, with only starlight providing minimal illumination, perfect conditions for their purpose. The men dismounted 50 yards from the tree line, securing their horses to prevent any whinnying or movement that might alert their target. They proceeded on foot, spreading out according to the plan Jackson had detailed earlier. Silas Turner and Levi Michaels circled toward the rear of the property, while the Fowler brothers, Daniel and Joseph, positioned themselves to cover potential escape routes along the eastern and western perimeters. Jackson advanced directly toward the front of the cabin, confident that Edwin was securing their retreat path along the main road. The Blackridge gang had executed similar operations dozens of times, surrounding isolated properties, intimidating occupants, extracting valuables and disappearing before authorities could respond. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency was well earned. Few victims resisted once they understood their predicament, and those who did quickly reconsidered. When faced with overwhelming force, "Remember," Jackson whispered as they separated, "we need her cooperative. No unnecessary violence unless I give the word." The men nodded, understanding, though Daniel Fowler's expression suggested disappointment. Jackson made a mental note to watch him closely. Fowler's growing appetite for cruelty had become a liability in recent operations. As they moved into position, Jackson assessed the cabin and surrounding structures. The main building stood 200 feet from the tree line, a solidly constructed log home with a pitched roof and stone chimney currently emitting no smoke. A covered porch wrapped around the front and one side with 4 visible windows, all dark. A smaller outbuilding that appeared to be a storage shed stood 30 feet behind the cabin, while a chicken coop occupied the eastern edge of the clearing near a well-tended garden plot. A single lantern burned inside the cabin, visible through a front window, suggesting the occupant was still awake despite the late hour. This complicated matters slightly, but didn't alter the fundamental approach. Jackson watched for several minutes, detecting no movement within. Perhaps Rebecca was reading or working at some quiet household task before retiring. Once his men confirmed their positions with subtle bird calls that blended with natural forest sounds, Jackson advanced toward the cabin. He moved confidently but cautiously across the open ground, maintaining awareness of potential defensive advantages the property layout offered. The cleared area around the cabin eliminated cover for approach, but would similarly hinder escape. The porch created elevated firing positions if the occupant proved armed and resistant. Reaching the edge of the porch steps, Jackson paused to study the cabin's exterior more closely. No horses in the adjacent paddock. The widow had no means of rapid escape. No dogs barked at his approach, another potential advantage neutralized. The wooden shutters on the windows were drawn but not fully closed, suggesting a false sense of security rather than tactical preparation. Jackson ascended, the steps, boots making minimal noise on the weathered planks. He positioned himself to one side of the door, standard procedure, to avoid being silhouetted or presenting an easy target through windows or cracks. After a final check confirming his men were in position, he knocked firmly on the wooden door. No. Response came. Jackson knocked again, louder, then adopted the falsely friendly tone that had disarmed previous victims. "Hello inside? Travelers seeking shelter from the cold night? Might we warm ourselves by your fire, ma'am?" From within, a woman's voice responded after a brief hesitation. "I'm afraid I'm not prepared for visitors this evening. The town of Pinecrest is just 8 miles south along the main road. They have a fine boarding house." The voice sounded calm, composed, not frightened as Jackson had expected. He frowned slightly, re-evaluating. Most women, particularly those living alone, displayed immediate anxiety when strangers arrived unannounced after dark. "Open up, woman," Jackson called, dispensing with pretense. "We ain't asking twice." "I cannot help you, sir," came the steady reply. "Please continue on your way." Jackson stepped back from the door, gesturing to the Fowler brothers who had joined him at the front of the cabin. They understood the silent command, moved to secondary entry points. Daniel headed toward a side window while Joseph circled toward the rear. As they moved into position, Jackson noted something unusual. The voice from within had come from a position beside the door, not directly behind it, as would be expected if the woman were simply responding to knocking. The realization triggered his combat instincts. Rebecca Caldwell wasn't behaving like a frightened, isolated widow. She was positioning herself tactically. Before he could process the implications, Jackson heard glass shattering as Daniel broke a side window to create an entry point. Moments later, Daniel's voice carried through the darkness, confused, almost alarmed. "I can't see a damn thing in here. It's pitch black." A strange stillness followed, broken by the distinctive sound of a hammer being cocked. Then Daniel's voice, rising in panic. "Boss, she's—" The crack of a gunshot shattered the night's silence, followed immediately by Daniel's startled cry and the sound of him tumbling backward through the broken window. "She can see in the dark!" he shouted to his companions. "She almost took my hand off." Jackson's tactical assessment shifted instantly. This was no ordinary confrontation with a helpless victim. The widow had been prepared, armed, and had somehow anticipated their approach. Most significantly, she had fired with precision, despite complete darkness, a feat that defied normal explanation. "Seems we've found ourselves an unusual widow," he called toward the cabin, adjusting his strategy to this unexpected development. "I'm impressed, ma'am. But you're still alone against 6, and we have your cabin surrounded. Why not be reasonable? We'll take what we came for and leave you unharmed." A moment passed before Rebecca's voice responded from near a front window, though Jackson couldn't see her through the darkness inside. "You're making assumptions, Mr. Preston. First, that I'm alone. Second, that darkness works in your favor. Neither is correct." Jackson tensed at the use of his name. How could she know who led the operation? Before he could respond, a bullet whistled past him, knocking his hat from his head with surgical precision. He dove for cover as his men returned fire, peppering the cabin's exterior with bullets that splintered wood, but seemingly found no target. Taking shelter behind a rain barrel at the edge of the porch, Jackson tried to reconcile what was happening. With his understanding of reality, the widow had fired twice now with extraordinary accuracy, first warning Daniel without harming him, then removing Jackson's hat without grazing his scalp. Both shots executed in complete darkness from inside. An unlit cabin, both demonstrating a level of marksmanship that few professional gunmen could match in broad daylight. "Hold your fire," he commanded his men, recognizing that blind shooting was wasting ammunition and potentially exposing their positions while gaining no tactical advantage. In the momentary quiet that followed, Jackson heard movement inside the cabin, deliberate, footsteps moving from one position to another with confident precision. No stumbling, no hesitation, as if the occupant could navigate the pitch-black interior as easily as a well-lit room. "Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson called, modulating his voice to project authority rather than threat. "This situation can still end peacefully. We know your husband brought something valuable home from the war. That's all we want. Tell us where to find it and we'll be on our way." No immediate response came. Jackson strained to detect any sound from within, but heard nothing for several long moments. Then, unexpectedly, a laugh. Soft, almost intimate, as if she were sharing a private joke rather than engaged in armed confrontation. Thomas brought "Many things home from the war, Mr. Preston," Rebecca finally replied, her voice closer to the front door now. "Nightmares, painful memories. A bullet lodged near his spine that the doctors couldn't remove." He paused then. "But if you're referring to Confederate Treasury certificates, you've been misled." Jackson exchanged glances with Levi Michaels, who had taken cover near the corner of the porch. Her specific knowledge of what they sought confirmed Captain Harrison's intelligence, while simultaneously denying its presence, a contradiction that raised more questions than it answered. "Captain William Harrison says differently," Jackson countered, attempting to unsettle her with evidence they had specific information. "Says your husband showed him 30 certificates, $1,000 each, after Fredericksburg. That's what we've come for, Mrs. Caldwell. Nothing more personal." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Jackson signaled Michaels to circle around toward the rear of the cabin, where Turner and Joseph Fowler should be maintaining their positions. They needed to reconsolidate, adapt their approach to this unexpectedly dangerous target. Before Michaels could move, Rebecca's voice came again, closer now, almost at the door, though no silhouette was visible through the windows. "William Harrison died at Chancellorsville, Mr. Preston. If someone claimed to be him, they lied to you. As for Thomas's certificates, they were redeemed years ago to purchase this property and establish our life here." Jackson felt uncharacteristic. Uncertainty creep into his tactical calculations. Could their intelligence have been fabricated? Was this entire operation based on false information? He had personally interviewed a man claiming to be Captain Harrison in a Lexington tavern 3 weeks earlier. The man had provided convincing details about Thomas Caldwell's service record and their shared experiences during key battles. "You're stalling Mrs. Caldwell," Jackson called, fighting to regain control of the situation. "Harrison is very much alive. Described your husband in detail. Tall man, beard, scar above his right eye from a saber cut. Thomas was of average height, clean-shaven, and the only scars he carried were bullet wounds in his left shoulder and thigh." Rebecca replied without hesitation. "You've been deceived, Mr. Preston. There's nothing of value here beyond what sustains a simple life." Jackson cursed silently. Either Rebecca was lying with remarkable composure, or the man in Lexington had fabricated a story designed to manipulate the Blackridge gang into targeting her property. Neither possibility aligned with their usual, carefully researched operations. New sound interrupted his thoughts, a low whistle from the direction where Daniel Fowler had been positioned after his retreat from the window. Jackson recognized their danger signal, indicating unexpected complications. Moments later, Daniel appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving in a crouched run toward Jackson's position. Blood darkened his right sleeve, where Rebecca's bullet had apparently grazed him more seriously than initially apparent. "Turner's not responding at the rear," Daniel reported in a harsh whisper when he reached Jackson. "Joseph went to check and hasn't returned. Something's wrong." Jackson's tactical assessment shifted again. If Turner and Joseph were incapacitated or had abandoned their positions, the cabin was no longer fully surrounded. The careful containment strategy that formed the basis of their approach was compromised. "She mentioned not being alone," Jackson muttered, recalling Rebecca's earlier statement. "Could be bluffing or she has help we didn't account for," Daniel finished, wincing as he adjusted his wounded arm. "What's the play, boss?" Before Jackson could respond, a new disturbance erupted from the direction of their secured horses. The animals whinnying in alarm, followed by the sounds of bridles being hastily untied and mounted riders departing at speed. "Someone's stealing our horses," Daniel hissed, his expression contorted with disbelief and anger. Jackson's mind raced through possibilities. The property had appeared deserted during Michaels's reconnaissance. No additional horses had been visible. In the paddock, either Rebecca had Confederates hidden nearby who had emerged to target their means of escape, or she had somehow slipped past their perimeter to reach the horses herself. Both scenarios suggesting a level of tactical capability far beyond what they had anticipated. "Fall back to defensive positions," Jackson ordered, recalibrating his approach yet again. "Michaels," he called softly, summoning the youngest gang member to join them. "Find Edwin. Tell him we need to consolidate and reassess." Michaels nodded, disappearing into the darkness toward the road where Edwin should be maintaining their rearguard position. Jackson turned his attention back to the cabin, noting that no further shots had been fired despite ample opportunity. Rebecca seemed content to maintain her defensive position, neither advancing nor retreating, an unusual choice for someone supposedly outnumbered and under siege. "She's toying with us," Daniel muttered, echoing Jackson's unspoken assessment. Like a cat with mice, Jackson had never encountered a target who seized tactical initiative so effectively, especially not a solitary woman in an isolated cabin. Standard intimidation had failed. Attempted entry had been repelled with precise, measured force. Their perimeter appeared compromised, and now their transportation was being systematically eliminated. Each development suggested they weren't facing a frightened widow guarding modest possessions, but someone with military-level tactical training executing a deliberate counter-strategy. The realization sent an unfamiliar chill through Jackson, the first stirrings of genuine uncertainty he had experienced during an operation since the gang's formation. Inside the cabin, Rebecca moved silently from window to window, tracking the outlaws' positions through her extraordinary night vision. The complete darkness that would have rendered most people helpless revealed the landscape to her in shades of blue-gray clarity, not as vivid as daylight, but more than sufficient for precise observation and targeting. She watched Jackson and Daniel conferring behind the rain barrel, noting their increasingly defensive posture, a significant shift from the aggressive confidence with which they had approached initially. Levi Michaels had disappeared toward the road, presumably to communicate with the sixth gang member positioned there. The remaining Fowler brother was nowhere visible, having either retreated to the forest edge or fallen victim to one of the traps Rebecca had placed around the property's perimeter. Earlier, she had observed Silas Turner attempting to approach from the rear, only to trigger one of her carefully positioned tripwires. The resulting bells had created momentary disorientation that allowed Rebecca to fire a warning shot near his feet from the back window. Turner had retreated hastily toward the trees, apparently deciding that further advance wasn't worth the risk. Rebecca assessed her tactical position with the dispassionate clarity she had developed during her scouting days. 6 opponents had been reduced effectively to 3 through strategic application of her advantages, superior knowledge of the terrain, exceptional night vision, and their underestimation of her capabilities. The loss of their horses would hamper mobility and likely create additional psychological pressure as their planned escape route disappeared. She moved to the front window again, positioning herself to observe without being visible from outside. Jackson Preston remained behind the rain barrel, but his body language had changed subtly, tension visible in his shoulders, head turning frequently as he assessed potential threats from multiple directions. The confidence that had marked his initial approach had eroded, replaced by growing wariness. Rebecca considered her options. She could maintain defensive positions indefinitely, protected by solid log walls and multiple firing points. Eventually, dawn would eliminate her primary advantage of superior night vision, but by then, Sheriff Hayes might have recognized potential danger and dispatched assistance from town. Alternatively, she could press her current advantage systematically, reducing opposition through measured force until the remaining gang members retreated. This approach carried greater risk of escalation, but might resolve the situation more quickly and decisively. As she weighed these options, Rebecca detected movement at the forest edge, a figure approaching cautiously from the direction where the horses had been secured. Her first assumption was that one of the gang members was investigating their lost transportation, but the silhouette's height and distinctive gait triggered immediate recognition. Sheriff Hayes. His presence complicated her tactical calculations significantly. Hayes was moving with reasonable stealth for a man without specialized training, but to Rebecca's enhanced vision, he might as well have carried a lantern announcing his approach. If she could track his movement this easily, Jackson or his men might eventually detect him as well, turning the sheriff from potential ally to vulnerable target. Rebecca made her decision quickly. She needed to draw attention away from Hayes's approach, giving him opportunity to reach the cabin safely. This meant transitioning from defensive to offensive operations, a shift that aligned with her military training, but conflicted with the healer's identity she had cultivated for 12 years. Checking her Remington cylinder to confirm 4 remaining bullets, Rebecca moved silently to the cabin door. She unlocked it with practiced care to prevent any sound that might alert those outside, then positioned herself to the side. Revolver. "Ready, Mr. Preston," she called, voice pitched to carry across the porch. "I believe we've reached an impasse. Perhaps it's time to discuss terms for your departure." From behind the rain barrel, Jackson responded with cautious interest. "What terms did you have in mind, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Simple ones. You and your remaining men withdraw immediately. In return, I don't put bullets through your skulls before dawn." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone one might use to discuss the weather. A psychological tactic Rebecca had observed unnerving even hardened soldiers during interrogations. A short, incredulous laugh preceded Jackson's reply. "Bold words from a woman still outnumbered. What makes you think you can deliver on such a threat?" Rebecca allowed a moment of silence before responding, letting tension build. "If I intended to kill you, Mr. Preston, you'd already be dead. Your hat removal was a demonstration, not a miss." She spoke. Rebecca eased the door open a fraction of an inch, just enough to expand her field of view to include more of the porch. Jackson remained behind the rain barrel, approximately 15 feet from the door, while Daniel had repositioned to the corner of the porch, partially concealed by a support post. "Perhaps," Jackson conceded, his tone suggesting he was playing for time rather than seriously considering withdrawal. "But killing has consequences, Mrs. Caldwell. The law treats self-defense differently from cold-blooded shooting." "I'm familiar with the distinction," Rebecca replied, "as is Sheriff Hayes, who should be arriving shortly. I imagine he'd view 6 armed men attacking a widow's home at midnight as justifying significant defensive measures." The mention of Hayes visibly unsettled Jackson, though Rebecca suspected her implied timeline was the cause rather than the sheriff's eventual arrival, which they had likely anticipated and planned around. By suggesting Hayes was imminent rather than already approaching, she hoped to draw attention toward the road rather than the forest edge where he was actually advancing. The strategy appeared effective. Jackson immediately signaled Daniel toward the front of the property, presumably to watch for approaching riders from the direction of town. This repositioning created an opening that Rebecca had been calculating. With Daniel moving away and Jackson temporarily focused on potential reinforcements, a momentary tactical advantage emerged. Rebecca seized it without hesitation. She pushed the door open fully and stepped onto the porch in one fluid motion. Remington raised and aimed directly at Jackson. The suddenness of her appearance froze both men momentarily. Neither had expected her to abandon the cabin's protection for direct confrontation. "Don't move," Rebecca commanded, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Either of you." In the darkness that rendered them nearly blind, Rebecca stood revealed in their lantern light, a slender woman in practical dark clothing, auburn hair secured in a tight braid, revolver held with unmistakable confidence. Her grey-green eyes reflected the lantern glow as she assessed both men with clinical detachment. Jackson recovered first, his hand inching toward his holstered weapon even as he adopted a conversational tone. "Brave move, Mrs. Caldwell. Probably not wise, though. Daniel there is an excellent shot, even in poor light." "He'd need to turn around first," Rebecca observed calmly. "By which time you'd be dead?" "I don't miss, Mr. Preston, particularly not at this range." The absolute certainty in her voice gave Jackson pause. Something about her stance, her grip on the revolver, the steady way she held his gaze, all suggested she wasn't bluffing or posturing, but stating simple fact. He had encountered many adversaries during his criminal career, but few exhibited such complete confidence under pressure. "You're not what you seem," he said slowly, intelligence overriding bravado as he reassessed the peculiar widow before him. "Who are you really, Mrs. Caldwell?" Rebecca's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition that events had reached a pivotal moment. For 12 years, she had maintained her quiet existence as a widow and healer, burying her past beneath layers of reinvention. Now circumstances forced that past into the open, beginning a chain of revelations that couldn't be easily contained once started. "Someone who sees better in darkness than you do in daylight, Mr. Preston," she replied finally. "Someone who learned long ago that appearances rarely capture truth." Her revolver remained unwavering, aimed at the center of his chest. "Now order. Your men to withdraw. This doesn't need to end with bloodshed." From the forest edge, Hayes had nearly reached the clearing, moving from tree to tree with the Winchester rifle ready. His approach remained undetected by the gang members, but Rebecca tracked his progress peripherally, even while maintaining focus on Jackson and Daniel. The sheriff's arrival would shift the balance further, potentially enabling peaceful resolution if the outlaws recognized their deteriorating position. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, a moment of suspended potential violence where the smallest provocation might trigger irreversible escalation. Rebecca held that edge with steady hands, awaiting Jackson's decision while calculating contingencies should he choose resistance over retreat. In that tense stillness, the complex interplay of identities that defined Rebecca Caldwell, healer and scout, widow and warrior, recluse and protector, achieved momentary alignment. The woman who stood unflinching on the darkened porch was neither fully the shadow scout who had guided soldiers through Confederate territory, nor entirely the herbalist who tended garden and mixed remedies, but a synthesis born of extraordinary circumstances and the inescapable pull of genuine nature. The Blackridge gang had surrounded a widow's cabin at night, believing darkness granted them advantage against an isolated, vulnerable woman. Instead, they had stumbled upon someone for whom darkness had always been ally rather than adversary, a fundamental miscalculation that had transformed predator into prey through the night's deadly equation. Sheriff Daniel Hayes froze at the forest edge, Winchester raised and ready as he absorbed the unexpected tableau before him. Rebecca Caldwell stood on her porch in plain view, not cowering inside as he had anticipated, but actively confronting two armed men with a steady revolver and steadier voice. The remaining gang members were nowhere visible, though Hayes suspected they hadn't simply departed, given the sounds of confrontation he'd heard while approaching. He had expected to find Rebecca under siege, perhaps barricaded inside while outlaws attempted entry. Instead, she appeared to be conducting an organized defense that had somehow gained her the tactical advantage, despite being outnumbered. Even more surprising was her stance and weapon handling. Not the nervous grip of a civilian forced into violence, but the practiced posture of someone with significant firearms experience. Hayes adjusted his assessment of both the situation and the widow herself. Something about Rebecca Caldwell wasn't adding up. Hadn't been adding up for years, if he was honest with himself. The reserved herbalist who avoided town gatherings had somehow transformed into a tactical operator facing down hardened criminals without visible fear. His immediate decision was whether to announce his presence or maintain concealment, potentially providing surprise backup if violence erupted. The tableau on the porch appeared precariously balanced, Rebecca holding Jackson and one of his men at gunpoint while demanding their withdrawal. Revealing himself might stabilize the situation through additional firepower or destabilize it by startling participants already on edge. Hayes opted for controlled revelation. He settled into a firing position with clear sightlines to both outlaws, then projected his voice with authoritative calm. "This would be an excellent time to surrender, Preston. Sheriff Hayes of Shenandoah County. Lower your weapons slowly." Jackson Preston's head snapped toward the voice, his hand freezing inches from his holster. Daniel Fowler similarly tensed, clearly calculating odds that had deteriorated further with Hayes's arrival. Rebecca didn't flinch at the sheriff's announcement, suggesting she had already been aware of his approach. Another detail that struck Hayes as remarkable given the darkness and distance involved. 6 against 1 were poor odds to begin with, Rebecca told Jackson, her revolver unwavering. Against a sheriff with a Winchester and a woman who doesn't miss, they become impossible. Make the sensible choice. Jackson's expression shifted through rapid calculations, weighing options, assessing escape routes, evaluating remaining assets. Hayes recognized the look from previous confrontations with cornered criminals, the dangerous moment when desperation might override rationality. Your brother's position is compromised as well, Rebecca added, as if reading Jackson's thoughts. Your horses are gone. This ends one of 2 ways, surrender or death. Choose wisely. Hayes advanced from the tree line, rifle trained on Jackson's chest. Where are the others? He demanded, scanning the property for remaining gang members. 1 at the road, 1 near the forest edge behind the cabin, Rebecca answered without shifting her gaze from Jackson. 1 disappeared toward the western perimeter. The last was near the chicken coop, but hasn't moved in several minutes. The precision of her situational awareness, despite complete darkness, astonished Hayes, but he maintained professional focus. Preston, I won't ask again. Order your men to surrender their weapons and emerge with hands visible. Jackson's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, the subtle yielding of a man recognizing inevitable defeat. Fowler, he called, not looking away from Rebecca's unwavering revolver. Drop your gun. Do it slow. Daniel Fowler hesitated, his expression twisting with reluctance and rage. For a moment, Hayes thought he might attempt resistance despite the overwhelming disadvantage. Daniel, Jackson said, voice hardening with command. Don't be stupid. Do as I said. Fowler finally complied, removing his revolver with theatrical slowness and placing it on the porch boards with a deliberate clatter. Jackson followed suit, his movements more controlled but equally compliant. Call the others in, Hayes instructed, advancing closer while maintaining his firing position. All of them. Jackson raised his voice to carry across the property. It's over, boys. Sheriff's here with reinforcements. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up. Several tense moments passed before movement at the forest edge revealed Silas Turner emerging with raised hands. No one appeared from the western perimeter or chicken coop, prompting Hayes to direct a questioning glance toward Rebecca. The one by the chicken coop triggered one of my traps, she explained, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. Unconscious, possibly concussed but alive, the western one likely fled when the horses were scattered. Hayes absorbed this information with growing bewilderment. Traps, scattered horses. The widow had apparently conducted a comprehensive counter-operation against professional criminals, something well beyond the capabilities of most trained lawmen, let alone isolated civilians. What about Edwin? Jackson asked, genuine concern bleeding through his controlled facade. Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the road, the sound of struggle followed by a triumphant whoop that Hayes immediately recognized as Deputy Collins' voice. Moments later, Collins appeared at the clearing's edge, prodding a sullen Edwin Preston before him with a shotgun. Found this one watching the road, Collins announced, clear pride in his successful capture evident in his voice. Tried to ambush me when I approached, but I heard him shifting position. He glanced around, taking in the scene on the porch. With obvious surprise, looks like you had things well in hand, Sheriff. Not me, Hayes replied, nodding toward Rebecca, who still maintained her vigilant stance despite the apparent resolution. Ms. Caldwell had the situation under control before I arrived. Collins' eyebrows rose as he reassessed the widow with newfound respect. Ma'am, he acknowledged with a slight nod. Rebecca finally lowered her revolver, though she maintained ready, positioning that would allow quick response if needed. We should secure them properly, Sheriff. I have rope in the storage shed. Hayes nodded agreement, momentarily disoriented by the role reversal, the civilian providing tactical direction to law enforcement rather than the opposite. Collins, keep these two covered while I check the one by the chicken coop. Miss Caldwell, if you'd fetch that rope. As Rebecca descended the porch steps to retrieve the binding materials, Hayes noted the fluid efficiency of her movement. Economical, balanced, alert to potential threats despite the apparent neutralization of danger. Nothing about her demeanor aligned with the reclusive herbalist persona she had projected for years. While Collins maintained watch over the captured outlaws, Hayes located Joseph Fowler lying unconscious beside the chicken coop, a crude but effective tripwire arrangement nearby that had apparently triggered a suspended weight to swing down at head height. The improvised trap showed ingenuity and practical understanding of defensive perimeter tactics, knowledge unusual for civilians but standard for military personnel. After confirming Fowler was alive, though thoroughly incapacitated, Hayes returned to find Rebecca efficiently binding Jackson's hands with professional-grade knots, while Collins covered the procedure with his shotgun. She had already secured Daniel Fowler and moved on to Edwin Preston, working with practiced ease that further confirmed Hayes's growing suspicions about her background. "You've done this before," he observed quietly as she finished securing the last outlaw. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the observation. "We should move them inside until transportation can be arranged. The temperature's dropping, and hypothermia won't help your case against them." Hayes nodded, directing Collins to assist in relocating the conscious prisoners while he retrieved the unconscious Fowler. Inside the cabin, Rebecca lit several lanterns, illuminating an interior that showed signs of meticulous preparation for the confrontation. Furniture positioned for cover, weapons staged at strategic positions, medical supplies ready for potential injuries. As the prisoners were secured to sturdy chairs under Collins' watchful guard, Hayes pulled Rebecca aside, keeping his voice low. "I think you owe me an explanation, Miss Caldwell." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind those unusual grey-green eyes that had always seemed to see more than they should. "Yes," she finally conceded, "but not here. Not now." Hayes glanced toward the captured outlaws, understanding her reluctance to reveal personal information in their presence. "Later, then, but I will expect answers." Rebecca nodded once, acceptance rather than submission in the gesture. "Fair enough, Sheriff. First, let's address immediate concerns." She moved to check Joseph Fowler's condition, examining his pupils and pulse with professional competence. "Concussion, as expected. He'll need monitoring but should recover without complications." "Where did you learn medical assessment?" Hayes asked, unable to contain his curiosity despite the agreement to postpone explanations. "The same place I learned to tie restraint knots," Rebecca replied with the ghost of a smile. "Experience teaches many skills when necessity demands." Before Hayes could press further, Jackson Preston's voice interrupted from across the room. "She's not who you think she is, Sheriff." His tone carried calculating malice beneath apparent helpfulness. "Ask her about the Shadow Scout. Ask her why a simple herbalist knows military tactics and shoots like a trained marksman in complete darkness." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Hayes noted the slight tension that appeared in her shoulders at Preston's words. "The desperate accusations of a captured criminal hardly constitute reliable information," she responded evenly. "Not an accusation," Jackson insisted, a predatory smile emerging despite his bound position. "An observation. You've hidden your true nature from these people for years, haven't you? Playing the quiet widow while concealing what you really are." Hayes studied Rebecca's reaction, noting her controlled breathing and deliberately neutral expression, techniques for managing emotional responses that he recognized from interactions with veteran soldiers. "That's enough, Preston," he said firmly. Save your stories for the judge, Jackson's smile widened. Not stories, Sheriff, but I'll wait. Truth has a way of emerging eventually, especially when it involves legendary war figures everyone believed dead or imaginary. The pointed reference clearly held meaning for Rebecca, whose composed facade momentarily showed a hairline crack of concern before smoothing over. Hayes filed the exchange away for later consideration, focusing instead on immediate logistics. "Collins, how did you know to come here?" he asked, turning to his deputy who maintained guard position near the prisoners. "After you left town, Sam." "Reynolds suddenly packed up and rode out despite the late hour," Collins explained. "Seemed suspicious given Martha's information about his connection to the man asking questions about Miss Caldwell. I followed at a distance, but he met up with someone on the road, and they both headed east instead of this direction." "Likely the sixth gang member," Hayes surmised. "The one Miss Caldwell mentioned fleeing earlier." Collins nodded agreement. "I turned back, figuring if Reynolds was involved with the gang, they might already be here. Heard gunfire as I approached. So I circled around to assess the situation, found the older Preston brother watching the road, and managed to get the drop on him." "Good work," Hayes acknowledged. "Though next time, request backup before pursuing armed suspects alone." Collins had the grace to look slightly abashed, though his expression brightened at Rebecca's unexpected intervention. "Your arrival was well-timed, Deputy," she said, "and your approach showed commendable tactical awareness." The genuine compliment from this suddenly mysterious woman clearly pleased Collins, whose respect for Rebecca appeared to be growing with each revealed capability. Hayes moved to the window, assessing the lightening eastern sky. "Dawn in about 2 hours. We need transport for these prisoners back to town. The wagon at your property, Ms. Caldwell, is it functional?" Rebecca nodded. "In the small barn. It will accommodate all 4, though not comfortably." "Comfort isn't my primary concern for the Blackridge gang," Hayes replied dryly. "Collins, help me hitch it up. We should move these men to proper cells before the rest of their associates might consider rescue attempts." As Hayes and Collins exited to prepare transportation, leaving Rebecca guarding the prisoners with her revolver, the sheriff's mind worked. Through accumulated observations and inconsistencies, the mysterious Shadow Scout reference, Rebecca's exceptional night vision and tactical capabilities, her professional handling of weapons and casualties, the military-grade knots and perimeter defense strategy, none aligned with the quiet herbalist, widow who had lived on the outskirts of his jurisdiction for 12 years. Yet all suggested a woman with specialized training and combat experience that simply shouldn't have been possible given what he knew of her background. In the small barn, as they prepared the wagon, Collins voiced what Hayes had been considering. "She's not just a healer, is she, Sheriff? The way she moved, how she handled those men." He paused, searching for appropriate words. "It was like watching a veteran soldier, not a civilian." Hayes checked the wagon's axle before responding. "People are rarely as simple as they first appear, Collins, especially those who deliberately maintain distance from others. But a woman with military training," Collins persisted, genuine confusion in his expression. "During the war, that would have been impossible unless—" He stopped abruptly as realization dawned. "Unless she wasn't known to be a woman." Hayes nodded slowly, pieces falling into place as he considered Preston's reference to the Shadow Scout, a near-mythical figure from war stories who had guided Union forces through Confederate territory with an almost supernatural ability to navigate in darkness. Always described as a young private known simply as Ross, slight of build but possessed of extraordinary night vision. A scout that many had suspected wasn't entirely human, given abilities that defied normal explanation. A figure that had disappeared after Chancellorsville, believed killed in action, though no body was ever recovered. "The war created unusual circumstances," Hayes said carefully. and required unusual responses from those capable of providing them. Collins secured the final harness strap, his expression thoughtful. If she's who I think Preston was suggesting, that would make her a hero, wouldn't it? Why hide such a thing? Heroes rarely see themselves that way, Hayes replied, drawing on his own war experiences. And women who served often found returning to normal life complicated by their unconventional choices. They led the hitched wagon to the cabin in contemplative silence, each considering the implications of Rebecca Caldwell's apparent hidden identity. Inside, they found the situation unchanged, prisoners secured, Rebecca maintaining vigilant guard, lantern light illuminating a room that showed remarkable strategic preparation for the night's events. As they loaded the prisoners into the wagon, Joseph Fowler having regained minimal consciousness, Hayes noted Rebecca conducting a final property check with methodical precision. She extinguished lanterns, secured doors and windows, and retrieved items from various defensive positions around the cabin, behavior that further confirmed his developing theory about her background. "You should come to town too," Hayes suggested. As she completed her preparations, at least temporarily, Reynolds is still out there, possibly with the sixth gang member. They might return seeking revenge. Rebecca shook her head, collecting the last of her strategically placed weapons. "I'll be fine, Sheriff. They won't risk confronting what they don't understand, at least not immediately. Fear of the unknown is a powerful deterrent." "And what exactly don't they understand?" Hayes pressed, seizing the opening. Rebecca's gaze met his directly, evaluating his readiness for truth after years of comfortable assumptions. "That some people see differently than others," she finally said. "In ways that change everything about how they navigate the world, especially in darkness." Before Hayes could pursue this cryptic response, Jackson Preston called from the wagon where he sat bound between his brother and Daniel Fowler. "You can't hide forever, Scout," he taunted, malicious satisfaction evident in his tone. "Once word spreads about what happened here tonight, others will come looking, some seeking the legend, others seeking to destroy it." Rebecca approached the wagon, her expression unreadable as she studied the gang leader. "Legends are often disappointing in person, Mr. Preston. I'm just a widow who prefers her privacy and happens to see well at night." "A widow who dismantled the Blackridge gang single-handedly before the sheriff even arrived," Jackson countered, leaning forward despite his restraints. "A widow who shoots with military precision in complete darkness and deploys tactical counter-strategies against superior numbers." His smile held no warmth. "Stories will spread, whether you wish it or not." "Then let me give you something specific to consider," Rebecca replied, her voice dropping to ensure only Preston could hear her next words. Hayes strained to catch them, but managed only fragments about consequences, and "those who pursue me," that carried unmistakable warning rather than defensive pleading. Whatever she said caused Jackson's confidence to falter visibly, his expression shifting from smug certainty to wary reassessment. He sat back, suddenly less inclined toward provocative statements, as Hayes secured the wagon for departure. "We'll need your formal statement regarding these events," Hayes told Rebecca, as Collins took the driver's position. "I'll return tomorrow once these men are properly secured." Rebecca nodded agreement. "I'll be here, Sheriff, and yes, we'll have that conversation you requested." As Hayes mounted his horse to follow the prisoner wagon back to town, he cast a final glance at Rebecca Caldwell, standing on her porch in the pre-dawn light. The woman who had lived quietly among them for 12 years now stood revealed as something more complex and formidable than anyone had imagined. A healer who could harm when necessary, a recluse with military discipline, a widow who had perhaps never been simply that at all. The contradictions should have felt discordant, yet Hayes found them strangely harmonious, as if Rebecca's seemingly incongruous capabilities actually formed a more coherent whole than the incomplete version of herself she had presented to the world. The question remaining was why such extraordinary abilities had been hidden behind the facade of an ordinary life for so many years. That answer, Hayes suspected, would prove more revealing than the night's events themselves. Rebecca watched the wagon and riders disappear down the road toward town, maintaining her composed exterior until they were completely out of sight. Only then did she allow herself a moment of genuine reaction, shoulders sagging slightly with released tension, breath exhaling in a long, controlled stream, hands flexing to dispel accumulated stress. The confrontation had concluded successfully from a tactical perspective. The Blackridge gang was neutralized, Sheriff Hayes and his deputy had escaped unharmed, and her property remained secure. Yet the victory carried significant complications that would reverberate long after the prisoners reached town cells. Jackson. Preston's pointed references to the Shadow Scout, a wartime identity Rebecca had believed long buried, introduced unpredictable variables into her carefully constructed existence. Hayes was too intelligent and observant to dismiss the connections Preston had highlighted. Questions would follow, requiring either elaborate deception or partial truth, neither option particularly appealing after 12 years of relative anonymity. Rebecca moved inside the cabin, surveying the disruption caused by the night's events. Broken window glass littered the floor beneath the side window where Daniel Fowler had attempted entry. Bullet holes peppered exterior walls where gang members had fired blindly into the darkness. Blood spots marked the floor near Joseph Fowler's restraint chair. Minor wounds, but evidence of violence she had hoped to leave behind with her scouting days. She began methodical cleanup, her mind processing potential consequences while her hands restored order. The immediate threat had passed, but Preston's parting observation held uncomfortable truth. Stories would inevitably spread. Pinecrest would buzz with embellished accounts of a widow who had outfought 6 armed men in darkness. Questions about her background would multiply. Patterns previously deemed coincidental would be re-examined with fresh suspicion. Her extraordinary night vision, the physiological anomaly that had shaped her entire life, would become subject to speculation rather than remaining a private attribute she managed through careful habits and limited social interaction. Some would view it with suspicion or fear, others with unhealthy fascination. The privacy she had cultivated so carefully might prove impossible to maintain. As Rebecca swept broken glass into a dustpan, she acknowledged the irony of her situation. The very ability that had allowed her to defend herself had also ensured she could never again be perceived as ordinary. Her exceptional vision had saved her life during the confrontation, while simultaneously threatening the life she had built. Dawn light gradually filled the cabin as she completed essential repairs, strengthening the damaged window with a temporary board covering until proper glass could be obtained. Rebecca moved to the porch as the sun crested the eastern ridge, watching familiar shapes emerge from darkness into color and detail. For most people, sunrise brought clarity after night's confusion. For Rebecca, whose eyes functioned better in darkness than daylight, the transition held different significance. A return to the world where her difference required careful management rather than providing natural advantage. She settled into a rocking chair, watching the forest reclaim its daytime rhythms as birds resumed singing and small animals emerged from nighttime shelter. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the violence that had unfolded hours earlier, yet Rebecca found herself unable to fully appreciate the restored tranquility. Jackson Preston's words echoed in her thoughts. Once word spreads about what happened here tonight, Others will come looking, some seeking the legend, others seeking to destroy it. The prediction carried uncomfortable truth. During her scouting days, Rebecca had made enemies beyond those wearing Confederate grey, men whose operations she had compromised, whose comrades had died following her guidance through dangerous territory. Some had survived the war, perhaps harboring grudges that would reignite if rumors of the Shadow Scouts' continued existence reached receptive ears. Equally concerning were potential allies, former commanders who might seek to recruit her specialized skills for post-war operations, government agents who viewed unusual abilities as assets to be controlled rather than individual traits to be respected. The war's end had brought official recognition for male heroes while erasing the contributions of women who had served in disguise or unauthorized capacities. That institutional blindness had provided convenient cover for Rebecca's disappearance into civilian anonymity. If that anonymity dissolved now, numerous interests might converge on her isolated cabin, each with agendas that threatened the independent life she had constructed. Rebecca rose from her chair, decision formed. She wouldn't abandon her home. Retreat would only confirm suspicions and potentially expose her to greater danger while traveling. Instead, she would manage the inevitable revelations proactively, providing Hayes with enough truth to satisfy his legitimate questions while establishing boundaries against excessive intrusion. The sheriff was fundamentally honorable, his interest professional rather than exploitative. He deserved honesty after years of community service that had indirectly protected her privacy. More practically, he represented potential alliance against those who might view her abilities with less benevolent intentions. Rebecca returned inside to change into fresh clothing, removing the practical dark garments that had served her during the confrontation and donning a simple dress more aligned with her public persona. The transition felt symbolic. Acknowledging the widow herbalist identity wasn't merely disguise, but a genuine aspect of who she had become during 12 peaceful years. As she plaited her hair into its customary braid, Rebecca studied her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin. The face looking back showed subtle signs of the night's exertion, heightened color in her cheeks, unusual brightness in her grey-green eyes, a certain alertness in her expression that belied her cultivated image of tranquil herbalist. The Shadow Scout had emerged from dormancy during the confrontation, tactical instincts and combat skills resurfacing with unsettling ease despite years of deliberate suppression. That part of herself, the young woman who had navigated battlefields with preternatural confidence in darkness, could not be simply reburied now that circumstances had forced its revelation. Integration, rather than compartmentalization, would be necessary moving forward, acknowledging both the healer she had genuinely become and the warrior she had never entirely ceased being. This synthesis would require careful navigation, particularly in explaining her background to Hayes, without exposing vulnerabilities that others might exploit. Rebecca completed her braid, expression resolving into determined acceptance as she faced the day that would inevitably bring the sheriff's return and his postponed questions. The night had forced one kind of revelation through confrontation. The coming days would require another kind through conversation and calculated disclosure. Tichin, thugs who had surrounded her cabin at night, had discovered she saw better in darkness than they did in daylight. Now Pinecrest would learn that Rebecca Caldwell contained similar unexpected depths, capabilities and experiences that defied conventional expectations about widows, herbalists, and women who chose solitude over society. She could only hope that Hayes, as the community's representative, would see her complete self with the same clarity she perceived the physical world through her extraordinary vision. recognizing the complex whole rather than fixating on seemingly contradictory parts. 2 days after the confrontation with the Blackridge gang, Sheriff Daniel Hayes returned to Rebecca Caldwell's cabin. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing as he approached, noting repairs already completed on the damaged windows and bullet-scarred exterior. Resilient and self-sufficient, qualities he had always recognized in Rebecca, though he now understood they stemmed from far deeper sources than he had imagined. As he dismounted near the porch steps, Rebecca emerged from the cabin with the same composed demeanor she had always presented to the community. Only now, Hayes perceived subtle details he had previously overlooked or misinterpreted. The measured assessment in her unusual eyes as she scanned surroundings, the balanced stance that distributed weight for immediate movement if needed, the deliberate positioning that provided clear sightlines in all directions. "Sheriff," she greeted him, gesturing toward the porch chairs. "I've been expecting you." Hayes secured his horse, then joined her on the porch, accepting the offered seat while placing his hat beside him. "The prisoners are secured in county cells," he reported. "Judge Wilson will hear their case next week when he makes his circuit." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement without appearing particularly concerned about legal proceedings. "And the townspeople? What are they saying?" "Direct and perceptive, prioritizing community reaction over judicial consequences." Hayes considered his response carefully. "Stories are spreading, as you anticipated, some more accurate than others." He watched her expression for reaction, finding only resigned acceptance. "Seems everyone has a different theory about how a solitary widow managed to outmaneuver 6 armed outlaws in complete darkness." "And your theory, Sheriff?" Rebecca asked, meeting his gaze steadily. Hayes leaned forward, clasping his hands between his knees. "I think it's time for truth rather than theories, Ms. Caldwell, or should I call you Private Ross?" The name hung between them, a bridge between her current identity and a wartime phantom that many had believed imaginary. Rebecca neither confirmed nor denied the connection immediately, instead rising to enter the cabin briefly before returning with a wooden box that she placed on the small table between their chairs. "Thomas suggested burning these after the war," she said, opening the lid to reveal official-looking papers, newspaper clippings and a small leather pouch. "I couldn't bring myself to erase that chapter entirely, though few besides him ever knew my actual role." Hayes examined the documents she passed him, military dispatches with coded references to Scout R, commendation letters addressed to Private A. Ross for extraordinary service during night operations, newspaper accounts speculating about the mysterious Shadow Scout whose night vision had supposedly saved hundreds of Union soldiers during critical engagements. "A. Ross?" Hayes questioned, looking up from the papers. "Amanda Ross," Rebecca explained. "My maiden name before I became Rebecca Caldwell. The disguise was Thomas's idea initially. He was my commanding officer before he became my husband." Hayes absorbed this revelation, mentally reconstructing the narrative that had remained hidden beneath the quiet, herbalist exterior. The Shadow Scout wasn't a myth. The legend was exaggerated, as legends tend to be, Rebecca replied with a slight shrug. But the basic facts were accurate. "I have unusually developed night vision, a congenital condition that allows me to see in near total darkness where others are effectively blind. The Union Army found this ability useful once. Thomas discovered it. How?" Hayes asked, genuinely curious how such an extraordinary capability had been identified and deployed. Rebecca's expression softened at the memory. "Pure accident. I was working as a nurse at a field hospital near the Maryland border. One night, Confederate raiders attacked, extinguishing all lights before their assault. In the panic and darkness, I was the only one who could navigate confidently, helping the wounded evacuate, guiding defenders to strategic positions." She paused, selecting a newspaper clipping from the box. Thomas was a captain then, recovering from a minor wound at the same hospital. He witnessed everything and immediately recognized the tactical potential. Within a week, I was unofficially attached to his unit as Private Alexander Ross, a young recruit with special scouting abilities. Hayes studied the clipping, a battlefield report mentioning a miraculous escape facilitated by an unnamed scout who guided troops through enemy territory during a moonless night. The pieces aligned with references he had encountered during his own military service, whispered stories about a scout with devil's eyes that could pierce the darkest night. "For 3 years, you operated behind Confederate lines," he said, piecing together the chronology, "then disappeared after Chancellorsville." Rebecca nodded, unconsciously touching a spot near her left shoulder where Hayes now suspected a war wound lay hidden beneath her practical dress. "A Confederate patrol discovered us returning from a reconnaissance mission. I was wounded, Thomas more severely. We barely escaped, and military records listed Private Ross as presumed killed in action." "Convenient," Hayes observed without judgment. "Necessary," Rebecca corrected gently. "The war was changing, as was my relationship with Thomas. We both needed to leave certain things behind." She retrieved a faded photograph from the box's bottom, a formal portrait showing a much younger Rebecca in civilian dress standing beside a tall man in Union cavalry officer's uniform. Thomas Caldwell's features were kind but serious, his posture reflecting military bearing even in this personal context. "We married quietly after my recovery and his medical discharge," Rebecca continued. "Moved west to start fresh where no one knew our history. Thomas purchased this property with his pension and some savings, and we established the life you've known me living for the past 12 years. Hayes handed the photograph back, noting the care with which she returned it to the box. "Why maintain such isolation after his death? The war ended. You could have disclosed your service, received recognition." Rebecca's expression contained complexities Hayes couldn't fully interpret. Pride tempered with regret, conviction shadowed by caution. Women who served openly as nurses faced enough difficulties returning to civilian life. Those who had served in disguise risked worse: scrutiny, scandal, even institutional punishment for violating military protocols. And my unusual vision. She paused, selecting words carefully. That attracted unwanted attention from people who viewed differences as something to study or exploit rather than respect. The explanation resonated with Hayes's own post-war experiences. The challenge of reintegrating into peaceful society when one's most recognized skills involved violence and strategy. For a woman with Rebecca's unconventional background, those challenges would have multiplied exponentially. "And the Confederate Treasury certificates Preston mentioned?" he asked, transitioning to the apparent motivation behind the gang's attack. Rebecca's laugh held genuine amusement. "Pure fiction. Thomas and I were barely comfortable, certainly not wealthy. We invested everything in this property and my herbal business." She shook her head at the irony. Preston apparently paid good money for false intelligence from someone claiming to be Captain Harrison, an officer who died at Chancellorsville and couldn't contradict the story. "An elaborate deception to target you specifically," Hayes observed, frowning at the implications. "Any idea who might have orchestrated it?" "Several possibilities," Rebecca replied, her expression growing serious. "Not everyone approved of my methods during the war. Some felt betrayed when Private Ross disappeared rather than continuing to serve their interests. Others lost status when operations I guided succeeded where their strategies had failed." The leather pouch from the box now rested in her hands. She opened it, revealing 3 tarnished brass buttons with faint military insignia still visible. "These belonged to officers who threatened to expose my identity if I didn't continue serving under their command after Thomas was discharged. I kept them as reminders that some dangers don't end when wars do. Hayes understood the implicit message. Rebecca had made enemies beyond Confederate forces, powerful men whose resentments might have festered during the intervening years. You think someone from your past arranged this attack? It's possible, she acknowledged, though equally possible that Preston simply encountered a conman selling false intelligence about hidden Confederate wealth. Either way, the immediate threat has passed, while creating an entirely new vulnerability through exposure. The assessment was tactically sound, exactly what Hayes would expect from someone with Rebecca's background. The Blackridge Gang's neutralization had eliminated one danger while potentially creating others, through the inevitable spread of stories about the widow who saw better in darkness than hardened criminals did in daylight. What will you do now? Hayes asked, genuinely uncertain what options remained for a woman whose carefully constructed anonymity had been so thoroughly compromised. Rebecca surveyed her property, the cabin she had maintained for 12 years, the garden that supplied both food and medicinal herbs, the peaceful clearing carved from wilderness through persistent effort. Her expression conveyed attachment without sentimentality, practical assessment of value beyond mere possession. "Stay," she said simply. "This is my home, Sheriff. I won't be driven from it by fear of what others might think or do." Hayes nodded, respecting the decision while recognizing its potential consequences. "The town will have questions. Rumors are already circulating about your military service, though most dismiss them as impossible given your gender." "Let them question," Rebecca replied with quiet determination. "I've spent 12 years helping their sick, easing their pain, addressing ailments their doctors couldn't cure. If my past service and unusual vision cause some to reconsider their assessment of me, perhaps that's overdue." The response held neither defensiveness nor bravado, just the clear-eyed pragmatism Hayes had always sensed beneath Rebecca's reserved exterior. She would face community reaction with the same steady resolve she had displayed during the confrontation. "With Preston's gang, I should inform you," Hayes said, shifting to more immediate concerns, "that Deputy Collins and Dr. Morrison have requested permission to visit once you've recovered from the incident. Collins seems particularly eager to hear about your military experiences firsthand." A hint of amusement softened Rebecca's expression. The young deputy showed considerable courage approaching the cabin alone. As for Dr. Morrison, she considered, this unexpected development. "Professional curiosity about my vision, I suspect." "Possibly," Hayes acknowledged, though he mentioned something about comparing herbal treatments for field wounds with conventional methods. "Seemed genuinely interested in your knowledge rather than merely your abilities." Rebecca appeared surprised by this information, perhaps the first indication Hayes had witnessed that events weren't proceeding exactly as she had calculated. "I would welcome their visit," she said after brief consideration, "when I'm prepared to receive guests." The qualifier was subtle but significant, asserting boundaries while accepting limited social reintegration on her own terms. Hayes respected this balanced approach, recognizing it aligned with Rebecca's fundamental nature as he now understood it, neither purely isolationist nor conventionally social, but selectively engaged based on principles and purposes that mattered to her. "There's another matter requiring attention," Hayes said, reaching into his coat to withdraw an official-looking envelope. "Judge Wilson requested I deliver this personally rather than through regular mail channels." Rebecca accepted the envelope, examining the judicial seal before opening it carefully. Hayes watched her expression as she read the contents, noting the brief widening of her eyes, the most unguarded reaction he had witnessed from her. "The judge wishes me to testify at the Blackridge Gang's trial," she summarized, looking up from the document. As primary witness to their criminal actions, Hayes nodded confirmation. Wilson's request is somewhat unusual but legally sound. The prosecution requires first-hand testimony regarding their activities on your property. Rebecca refolded the document thoughtfully. This would require public appearance in the county courthouse. Formal statements under oath about exactly what happened that night. Yes, Hayes confirmed, though Wilson has indicated willingness to limit questioning regarding your background to matters directly relevant to establishing witness credibility. The judicial consideration reflected Wilson's reputation for fairness and discretion, qualities that had earned him respect throughout the county circuit. Still, public testimony would inevitably accelerate community awareness of Rebecca's unusual capabilities and history. "I'll comply, of course," she decided after careful consideration. Justice requires proper process, whatever personal discomfort it might cause. Hayes had expected nothing less, yet still found himself impressed by her willingness to face public scrutiny after years of deliberate privacy. "The trial begins next Wednesday. I can arrange transportation if needed." "Thank you, but I'll manage my own arrangements," Rebecca replied, with the self-sufficiency that characterized her approach to most matters. She hesitated, then added, "Though I would appreciate your advice regarding appropriate presentation for court appearance. My experience with civilian judicial proceedings is limited." The request for guidance, however practical its nature, represented significant trust from someone who had maintained fierce independence for over a decade. Hayes recognized its importance beyond the specific question of courtroom attire or demeanor. "Simple, respectable clothing, similar to what you might wear to church services," he suggested. "Direct responses to questions without elaboration unless requested. Your natural dignity will serve well in that environment." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement, then secured the court summons in her dress pocket before returning her attention to Hayes. "Will there be criminal charges against Sam Reynolds for his involvement with the gang?" The question reflected tactical thinking, assessing all potential threats rather than focusing solely on those already neutralized. Hayes appreciated her thoroughness while noting her continued vigilance despite apparent resolution of immediate danger. "Reynolds fled before we could question him," he explained. "Based on Collins's observations and Preston's subsequent confession, we've issued warrants for his arrest on conspiracy charges. He won't return to Pinecrest anytime soon, if ever." This information appeared to satisfy Rebecca's security concerns. Though Hayes suspected she would maintain heightened awareness regarding potential threats regardless of official assurances. 12 years of peaceful existence hadn't eroded her fundamental caution, perhaps the most enduring legacy of her wartime experiences. As their conversation reached natural conclusion, Hayes replaced his hat and prepared to depart. He hesitated. At the porch steps, feeling certain questions remained unaddressed despite their extensive disclosure. "One last thing, Ms. Caldwell," he said, turning back toward her. "Your exceptional vision, is it truly as effective as demonstrated during the confrontation? You navigated absolute darkness with perfect accuracy, while armed men fired blindly." Rebecca considered the query carefully, weighing decades of protective discretion against newfound openness. "My condition is rare, but documented in medical literature," she finally explained. "The eye contains structures called rods and cones that process light. Most humans have predominantly cone-based vision, which requires significant light but perceives color. My vision relies more heavily on rods which function in minimal light but primarily detect movement and form rather than color." The clinical description contrasted with the almost supernatural capabilities Preston had attributed to her, yet Hayes recognized the practical advantage such vision would provide in combat situations, particularly night operations behind enemy lines where conventional soldiers would be effectively handicapped by darkness. "That's why you maintain limited lighting in your cabin," he realized, connecting observation with explanation, and prefer dawn or dusk for gardening rather than bright midday sun. Rebecca nodded confirmation. Bright light can be uncomfortable when your eyes are adapted primarily for darkness. I've developed habits that accommodate my differences while appearing reasonably normal to observers. The explanation illuminated countless small peculiarities Hayes had noticed over years of professional interaction. Her preference for shaded porch conversations, the deep bonnet she wore during town visits, the thick curtains visible on all cabin windows. Adaptations for physiological necessity rather than mere eccentricity or reclusiveness. "Thank you for your candor," Hayes said with genuine appreciation for her trust. "Your secret, all your secrets, are safe with me beyond what legal obligations require." "I know," Rebecca replied simply. "You've demonstrated integrity consistently during your tenure as sheriff. It's why I chose to remain in your jurisdiction after Thomas died, despite opportunities to relocate elsewhere." The acknowledgement of his professional character pleased Hayes more than he would have expected. Recognition from someone whose own standards were evidently exceptional in multiple domains. As he mounted his horse for the return journey to Pinecrest, Hayes considered the remarkable transformation in his understanding of Rebecca Caldwell within just 3 days. The heathed, quiet herbalist widow had revealed herself as a Union scout with extraordinary capabilities who had served with distinction during the nation's darkest conflict. More significantly, she had demonstrated that both identities were authentic aspects of a complex whole rather than mere disguise or reinvention. "Sheriff," Rebecca called as he prepared to depart, "there's another letter in that judicial packet, one addressed to you personally." Hayes paused, surprised by this information. "From Judge Wilson?" "From the War Department," Rebecca clarified, her expression unreadable. "Apparently, my existence has already attracted official attention beyond local jurisdiction." The implication sent a chill through Hayes, despite the warm afternoon sun. Government interest in Rebecca's reappearance could manifest in multiple ways, some potentially beneficial regarding long overdue recognition, others potentially intrusive regarding her unusual abilities. "Do you want me to intervene?" he offered, uncertain what practical assistance he could provide against federal authority, but willing to attempt whatever protection his position might enable. Rebecca's smile held genuine warmth, for perhaps the first time in their acquaintance. "No, Sheriff, but I appreciate the offer more than you might realize." She gestured toward the letter in his saddlebag. "Read it first. Then we'll discuss appropriate responses when you return for pre-trial consultation." Hayes nodded agreement, recognizing her pragmatic approach to potential complications. They would address each development methodically as it emerged rather than reacting with premature concern or unwarranted optimism. This balanced perspective had evidently served Rebecca well through extraordinary circumstances, from battlefield operations to frontier isolation to criminal confrontation. As he rode away, Hayes glanced back to see Rebecca still standing on her porch, a slender figure backlit by afternoon sun, watching his departure with the same measured attentiveness she applied to all significant movements within her domain. No longer the mysterious widow whose reserved manner generated community speculation, yet not merely the legendary scout whose exceptional vision had guided soldiers through impossible darkness. Something more complex and genuine than either limited characterization, a woman who had navigated between worlds, between identities, between light and shadow, with remarkable resilience and unwavering integrity. The thugs who had surrounded her cabin at night had discovered she saw better in darkness than they did in daylight. In doing so, they had inadvertently illuminated the extraordinary individual who had lived quietly among ordinary people for 12 years. hidden in plain sight like the most valuable treasures often are. 2 months later, Rebecca Caldwell stood on her porch, watching approaching riders with calm assessment rather than tactical vigilance. The Blackridge Gang's trial had concluded with predictable results. Guilty verdicts, followed by substantial prison sentences that effectively neutralized any personal threat they might have posed to her safety or privacy. More significantly, Rebecca's testimony had introduced her to the wider community beyond Pinecrest in her authentic complexity, rather than the limited persona she had previously presented. Initial reactions had predictably included skepticism, sensation-seeking curiosity, and occasional suspicion about her unconventional background. Yet as public attention gradually faded, something unexpected had emerged in its place. Measured acceptance based on demonstrated character rather than preconceived expectations about widows, herbalists, or women in general. The same community that might have rejected her extraordinary aspects had instead incorporated them into expanded understanding of a person whose actions had consistently benefited others, whether treating ailments or confronting violent intruders. Deputy Collins was first to dismount as the small party reached her cabin, followed by Dr. Morrison and, somewhat surprisingly, Walter Miller, the blacksmith, whose daughter Jenny had apparently become Mary Morrison's apprentice in nursing following recent events. The visitors carried various items: books from Morrison, a small mechanical contraption from Miller that appeared designed for gripping herbs during processing, and official documents from Collins that likely represented Sheriff Hayes's latest update regarding War Department correspondence. Rebecca welcomed them with genuine, rather than performative, hospitality, having gradually adjusted to limited social engagement as an acceptable middle ground between complete isolation and conventional integration. These particular visitors had demonstrated respect for her boundaries while offering professional collaboration that acknowledged her unique knowledge and experiences without exploitation or excessive curiosity. As she prepared coffee for her guests, Rebecca reflected on the unexpected equilibrium that had emerged from circumstances that had initially threatened everything she had built since the war's end. The confrontation with Preston's gang had indeed exposed her carefully protected secrets, but exposure had ultimately proven less destructive than anticipated. Sheriff Hayes had managed official interest in her reappearance with diplomatic skill, coordinating with Judge Wilson to ensure her privacy remained protected while facilitating long-overdue recognition of her wartime service through appropriate channels. The process remained ongoing, but initial communications suggested legitimate appreciation rather than intrusive scrutiny would characterize governmental response to the Shadow Scouts' unexpected re-emergence. More personally significant was Rebecca's evolving relationship with her own complex identity. The necessity of explaining her unusual vision and history to legal authorities had paradoxically liberated her from the exhausting compartmentalization that had characterized her post-war decades. Integration, rather than segregation of her capabilities and experiences, had created unanticipated psychological ease, acceptance of her complete self rather than selective presentation of acceptable aspects. As Rebecca served coffee to her visitors, on the porch where she had once confronted armed intruders in darkness, she recognized that the night's events had transformed more than just her community standing or security arrangements. They had catalyzed reconciliation between the young scout who had navigated battlefields with extraordinary vision and the mature healer who had built a constructive life from war's aftermath. The thugs who surrounded her cabin that moonless night had discovered she saw better in darkness than they did in daylight. In doing so, they had inadvertently illuminated paths forward that neither complete concealment nor full exposure could have revealed. the balanced middle ground where genuine identity could flourish without either defensive isolation or vulnerable. Overexposure. Rebecca Caldwell, herbalist, widow, veteran scout, had found her rightful place between shadow and light, her extraordinary vision finally serving her complete self rather than fragmentary aspects of a divided identity. The darkness that had always been her ally had ultimately led her toward unexpected illumination, revealing not just threats that required confrontation, but possibilities that invited exploration with the same courage she had once demonstrated. On midnight battlefields. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.